All right, thanks, folks. Appreciate you all coming out for this. So a little bit of background. We've got a couple things going on lately. We've got a comprehensive energy plan to write, and we've got a Global Warming's Solution Act Climate Council that is also working to figure out how we reduce GHG emissions in Vermont. So this technical workshop came about as a result of sort of the coordination of these two processes. I've been working with Rich and Liz and Chad and a bunch of other folks on the cross-sector subcommittee of the Climate Council. I'm also helping out here at the Department of Public Service with developing the comprehensive energy plan. So before we go too much farther, I'll just say first off, sorry for this. My name is Ed McNamara. I'm planning director at the Department of Public Service. With me in the room is Claire McElvaney, who's been doing a tremendous amount of work on all of this, setting this up. So appreciate all her help on this. Liz Miller and Chad Farrell have also been engaged and working with us from the Climate Council side to help make sure that this is a thorough process and trying to make sure we consider all the different factors. In terms of the overall purpose of today, both Climate Council and Comprehensive Energy Plan are focused on reduction in GHG emissions in different energy sectors. So folks are aware at this point, a lot of our work needs to be done in the transportation and thermal, pretty much all sectors, but transportation and thermal are the biggest GHG emitters. And electrification is going to be one of the key areas that we need to pursue in order to reduce GHG emissions. To do that, we also need a clean electric grid as well. So what we're going to be focusing on today is how to design a renewable energy standard, a requirement to actually have our underlying electric portfolio be as renewable as possible. Liz and I have put forward a proposal in the cross-sector subcommittee of the Climate Council to look at 100% renewable energy standard. And Chad's agreed to help us out as well and think about what are the design parameters, what do we need to think about as you're designing 100% res. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute. I do want to introduce, so I've already mentioned Chad, I see you on there. Liz, you're there as well. So thanks to both of you for all the work. I want to turn this over to Cindy Cook. Cindy is a facilitator that the department, DPS department, has hired to help us out with comprehensive energy plan. Cindy is with Adamant Accord, and Cindy, I'll turn this over to you for a minute.
Thanks, Ed. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So I want to do a quick run through of the agenda and the etiquette for Zoom, which you're probably fairly familiar with. So we'll start with introductions. We're going to do that via chat. So if you haven't already done so, please go to the chat function and put in your name and your affiliation and anything else you want to say about your participation here today. So then we'll look at Ed. I'm going to pass it over to Ed in a minute to do a state of the state where the department is and where it's going. We'll have a session on equity considerations in renewable energy planning. Midday, we'll take a break, and then we'll look at design considerations for 100% renewable energy standards in Vermont. At 1 o'clock, we'll we'll have a presentation and then discussion from starting at noon. At 1, somebody from Massachusetts Department of Energy is going to speak, and then we'll continue the discussion on design considerations. Just before 2, we'll wrap up. And so that's the plan for the morning and early afternoon. Are there any questions about the agenda? Okay, so let me run through etiquette. Somebody from the department will keep people muted unless you're speaking. That helps with bandwidth in case there are folks that have limited Wi-Fi capabilities. We ask that if you want to speak, that you raise your hand using the Zoom option. We ask that you be clear and concise, asking people to keep their initial comments to 2 to 3 minutes at most. And I'll jump in if people are taking up a little bit too much of your time, because we want to have a chance for everybody to be able to speak. If you're on the phone, please mute your phone by pressing *6 and then unmute by doing the same. And let's see, last thing is the department is accepting comments until the end of October. So feel free to comment at more length via email or snail mail. And finally, just a reminder that this session is being recorded and will be posted on the web. So any questions about etiquette logistics? Okay, great. So I'm going to pass it back over to you, Ed.
So,
for
I'm sorry.
setting the table here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I do have one question. I'm not finding the raise hand icon. Where is that in Zoom?
It's down at the bottom. Let's see. Philip, can you jump in here?
Sure, James. At the bottom, each version of Zoom is slightly different depending on what type of device you're using. But under reactions at the bottom, down by chat or participants,
Got it.
one of the options is raise hand.
Got it.
Though
Thank you.
I hope we'll see some hearts from you, James.
Okay. Any other logistical questions? Great. Thanks, James. And over to you, Ed.
Great, thanks. So Jane, are you here? Jane Laserchuk. Not hearing, but in theory, Jane is on. So
I'm here. It was just not muting. Morning, Ed. Morning, everyone.
Great. Morning, thank you. So Jane is Director of Global Warming Solutions Act, works with Agency of Natural Resources, sort of embedded within natural resources. And Jane's been doing an amazing job keeping us moving and keeping the Climate Council moving forward. So Jane's also been helping out with this as well, some of the coordination. And the next presentation we're doing is a brief discussion about what the Comprehensive Energy Plan is. And Jane's going to touch on GWSA, and then we'll talk a little bit about the coordination. So just a little bit of background, Vermont energy policy. I start a lot of presentations with this. Essentially, it's the energy policy of the state is ensure that energy is affordable, reliable, and sustainable. And also embedded within that, it's a mandate that we achieve the GWSA GHG reductions. So that's not an option in terms of thinking about these trade-offs, that's a requirement, but there are still 3 different aspects that we're always trying to balance: affordability, reliability, and sustainability as well. So Comprehensive Energy Plan is discussed a lot. It's actually 2 separate plans that we've combined together for the last several iterations. So first off, we do it every 6 years. Last one was January 2016, so we've got one coming up relatively soon. Comprehensive Energy Plan actually looks at all energy in the state, so thermal, transportation, in addition to electric as well. And we look out 20 years and figure out how to obtain that energy while meeting that affordable, reliable, sustainable, those goals. The electric plan also looks at how we balance the electric side. It's a little bit more prescriptive there. And the electric plan has an additional statutory consideration that has to embody the principles of least cost planning. I'll be talking about that later on. So the CEP also we developed standards and recommendations for Act 174. Act 174 was essentially, a couple of years ago, the legislature decided that all regional planning commissions had to develop enhanced energy plans, thinking about siting of renewable generation and also just overall use, demand reduction, and thinking about it cohesively as well, transportation, heating, and electricity as well. And then also, as I noted before, GWSA has changed the framework for energy planning in the state. It is mandatory that we achieve the GHG reductions. So the last CEP was 2016. Recommendation was 90% renewable. And this is across all sectors, not just electric. There's about 300 recommendations embedded within that. I will say one of the major recommendations of the 2016 CEP was looking at total energy flow within the state, and then also recommending and putting us really on this path towards electrification as a means to lower emissions in the thermal and transportation sectors and increase renewability as you increase the underlying electricity to provide for that electrification. So for 2022, for the existing CEP, we're using as a starting point that 90% renewable by 2050, we're retaining that, excuse me, also retaining the GWSA requirements as well, which are shown on this graph. Another aspect too is that this plan, I mentioned before, the 2016 CEP had about 300 recommendations scattered throughout. What we're looking to do for this CEP is focus more on the strategic plan. So identify some trade-offs among policies, look at milestones. When can you say, yes, this is a success, or when do you say, there's something that's come up, there's a barrier that's come up, we need to modify how we think about this. What are some of the uncertainties that can affect the success of different policies? So we're really focusing much more on the strategic component. Again, it's going to have the Act 174 standards, climate, renewable energy pathways, the electric plan. The state and agency energy plan is developed by Buildings and General Services state agency, and it's basically the state's lead by example plan, how the state of Vermont is going to incorporate the recommendations of the CEP. To inform the CEP, we've also been doing a lot of modeling. TJ Poor at the department's been leading this up, and we're using the LEAP model, Low Emissions Analysis Platform, and working with Agency of Natural Resources. And NESCOM is, I forget the exact name, but they're essentially the air quality, it's a regional air quality organization, especially for the Northeast, I believe. Stockholm Environment Institute created the LEAP platform several years ago. It's been used pretty extensively throughout many states. And it's essentially scenario-based modeling. So you can put in assumptions about production, consumption, resources, and pull a couple levers and understand what actually is what are the likely results. Right now, we do have the base case policy already developed that's been presented to the Climate Council, I believe at least once, and probably to some of the subcommittees as well. This modeling is also being used to help us inform the Act 174, the regional standards. Right now it's statewide, and we're looking to then bring that down to the regional level after we get some initial modeling results. And I know ANR is also using this model to help understand non-GHG pollutants as well, both at the local level and regional. So for overall timeline, we've been working on this for a while now. We've had some stakeholder engagement about the modeling. Where we are right now is really these technical workshops, focusing on electric sector. There's one coming up. I think the next one is thermal, and then transportation the week following that. Modeling is still taking place during all this time. And we are working, I know TJ is working with folks at the Climate Council on some of the modeling, including some of the inputs. So the draft CEP, we expect to have something published in October, a draft to get comments on, to start thinking about how, what we got right, what we got wrong, what we need to add, those kind of things. We're definitely looking for comments later on that. And then provisionally adopting a CEP, and I'm saying provisionally adopting because one of the key features of the CEP that's different this time is there's a climate action plan that Jane will touch on. And we're really trying to be as consistent as possible. The statute says the CEP has to be consistent with the climate action plan. And we really don't want to get out in front of the Climate Council on this, which is part of why we've actually had these joint meetings as well. And at that, Jane, I think that's over to you.
Sorry, I'm having so much trouble unmuting today. Morning, everybody. Thank you, Ed, for the introduction. And I appreciate the time, and hopefully I won't start from a place of overwhelming you with too much information, but I wanted to assume that as little as possible with how much you know about the Global Warming Solutions Act to build the case for why both the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the CAP are so important, not only as required by, but to serve Vermonters in the best capacity to be coordinated. So first off, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed last fall, and the administration had 30 days from receiving that final appointment to convene the first meeting of the council. The Vermont Climate Council is the body that oversees the implementation of the Climate Action Plan and the Global Warming Solutions Act itself. It is comprised of 15 legislative appointments from the House and Senate representing various interests and 8 administration officials. In addition to the council, there are 5 subcommittees which began to meet in February of this year that are really in service to the Climate Council in developing the body and breadth of what will be the Climate Action Plan. All of this is moving towards the council adopting the first Climate Action Plan on December 1st of this year, recognizing that this is 1 in 4 years we'll adopt every climate action plan going forward. And this is the first, really excitingly, is tied in coordination with the development of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, but going forward, that will only happen once every 12 years. So this is a unique moment right now that we have to align these 2 plans and think about how we get it right. Next slide. So in addition to the Climate Council, the 23-member body, we have a steering committee that works in service to advance the work of the Climate Council and keep the body moving. As of late, the council meets monthly, but as we sort of shift into high gear to work to adopt that Climate Action Plan this fall, we'll start to meet bi-weekly as a council, recognizing that the work at the subcommittee level will now be coming up to the Climate Council to adopt and approve for the implementation and action in the Climate Action Plan itself. There were 4 subcommittees put in statute, as well as the discretion of the council to form any other necessary subcommittee to do the work needed to develop the Climate Action Plan. The Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee works in service to developing resilience and adaptation strategies with a specific emphasis on the impacts on rural communities. Cross-sector mitigation is thinking about strategies to reduce and meet our emissions requirements as outlined in the GWSA. The Just Transition Subcommittee is thinking a lot about the equity component core to the work across the council and across the subcommittees. The Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee is thinking about sequestration in Vermont, as well as thinking about resiliency in our natural and working lands. And then finally, the last subcommittee was developed and put in place by the council, which is the Science and Data Subcommittee, which is core to the underpinning of the science and data needed across all of the subcommittees to inform the best policy going forward. Next slide, Claire. So my next few slides are, I tend to hate text-heavy slides, but I do just want to put up for everybody to understand the breadth of what we're trying to accomplish in a really short period of time. The law was very specific around the requirements to be included in the first Climate Action Plan. It speaks to 7 specifically, although first and foremost is that this plan is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We have specific targets laid out for 2025, 2030, and 2050, as Ed spoke to, that the Comprehensive Energy Plan needs to meet as well. Those requirements in statute are what we're striving for. With this first Climate Action Plan, we must come up with the strategies and actions needed to meet the cumulative assessment needed for the 2025 requirement. This is our first and only shot likely to get this right, to put together the actions needed to get there. That said, these other 6 components of the requirements are all work that we're trying to tackle, as well as develop what success looks like and how to meet and set measurable goals related to the resiliency work and sequestration work that we know puts together a complete climate policy package. We can't just do emissions. Regardless of how much we cut our emissions, the climate is changing and we need to adapt and plan for that. Next slide, please. One of the benefits also in setting up a framework for the work was the Global Warming Solutions Act set forward a clear process for how the work would unfold within the subcommittees. As we moved forward with implementing and refining the work of the subcommittees and the scope of work to ensure that all of the components of the requirements of the GWSA would be represented in one of the 5 subcommittees, the sequence as follows was to think about and inventory existing programs to meet the GWSA requirements, as well as to think about sequestration goals and resiliency work as to not reinvent the wheel, but think about how we can invest in existing programs and reinvest in programs to really step up our work in those areas. The next phase was to really think about and identify and analyze, evaluate new strategies that were going to be needed. And that's sort of where we're at right now. And I'll get to this in the next slide, but we're at that high level. We've come up with the what is necessary, and the work over the next few months, informed by the scientific modeling, informed by public engagement, informed by these stakeholder events, will help us think about the actions that we know we need to take and the how are we going to get at the what that needs to be done. And I just want to mention there, because I don't have a specific slide on modeling, is that one of the beauties of this coordination with the Public Service Department is that because the LEAP modeling was underway for the Public Service Department in coordination with ANR, the Climate Council is using and building upon that LEAP modeling as well to have the same underpinning for our climate action plan as the CEP. We also are able to bring more resources to that to do more mitigation modeling, as well as take it further with respect to thinking about the economics and of the choices that we make in policies. We'll also be working with the same technical analysis group. CADNIS is who's working with us to develop a monitoring strategy for us to be able to assess how those policy levers are working. And then for this climate action plan, we'll also be thinking about rule making for ANR specifically, as well as other administration action, programmatic changes, and legislative action needed to implement the climate action plan. And all of this will happen by December 1st if we're successful. Next slide, Claire. So I mentioned this slide because this has sort of been the model that we finally have agreed to. There's a lot of framing that can be done in planning. And the model that we've adopted for the climate action plan and where we're at right now is the development of the pathways and strategies. A pathway being a high-level means for achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions or adaptation, resilience, and sequestration goals. So there's pathways that have been put forward. They're online at the Climate Council website. You can see them across all sectors, as well as a suite of strategies that are available now in those presentations on the website to illuminate what the suite of strategies will be needed under each pathway to achieve that goal. What we haven't done yet and what we're starting to do now, and why this work with all of you is so important, is to think about how we're going to operationalize this work through action and how we're going to formalize and think about the implementation of this work going forward. So this is how we envision all pathways and strategies being put forward in the climate action plan and the comprehensive nature of how to address climate action in Vermont. And we're hoping that through work with all of you, as well as the technical analysis and public engagement, we'll have a suite of actions that are ready to implement for this first climate action plan, as well as a whole other suite of actions that will need some further refinement over the course of the next 4 years to bring to fruition and further flesh out. But we're trying to really be concise and put forward that first suite of actions that really gets us on our way. Next slide. As there's a focus today on equity, I just want to call to attention that the work of the Just Transitions Committee to date has really been on defining what a just transition means for Vermont with respect to implementation of strong climate policy, recognizing the impacts that it has on different industries as well as communities on the front line of feeling the impacts of climate change. And in order to do that, we put forward a set of guiding principles that are the basic framework for how we're thinking about the development of pathways and strategies and action. And I reference this for you all to look at and think about as we're developing the ideas put forward today and in the future. Next slide. I also just want to say that while equity is core to the work that we're doing, and we're only starting that work now, we're going to be thinking about how we build in equity and the work going forward all the way through implementation. It's a long endeavor. We're also thinking about how we elevate actions and strategies that have co-benefits that help us meet our emissions reductions, but also have resiliency benefits as well as sequestration. There's a mandate in the law to put forward cost-effective actions for implementation. And then, of course, we need to put forward ideas that are technically feasible and make progress towards what we choose to measure in the Global Warming Solutions Act, whether it's the emissions reductions that are already in statute or other measurable goals that we are trying to identify now with respect to sequestration as well as resiliency efforts. All of this will have to be put in the context of our short-term priorities and our long-term priorities. Next slide. So just quickly, the process to date has really been at the subcommittee level for where we've been organizing this work. Those meetings are all open to the public, and we've had robust public engagement at those meetings. It's been really exciting to see people continually show up, speak up, and participate in that forum. But we know we have to do better. So we also thought a lot about the subcommittees as we formed them to bring both the technical expertise as well as the diversity needed to consider the work in front of us. And then we've had that work all presented by task leads at the subcommittees and then now up to the council. And it's this next phase of garnering technical feedback from all of you is where we're at in this process, as well as future engagement that I'll illustrate on the next slide, I believe, Claire. So we have a robust public engagement timeline. It doesn't start and finish along this timeline. We've had public engagement from the inception, well, from the development of the Global Warming Solutions Act to get it passed. And then with its inception, we've been doing our best to think about public engagement in a new way. Rather than putting something out for the people to react to, we're really trying to embark on what we've been terming a co-creation process with the public. And this timeline is really about the immediate actions with respect to stakeholder engagement over the course of this month and into September on specific technical expertise, as well as launching into broader Vermont engagement at a statewide and regional level, both through in-person events, 4 that are planned for in September, as well as 3 online events, so that all of this feedback can be going directly to the subcommittees and council to incorporate and revise and develop their actions with. So that's just one phase. And we know that as we launch the plan in December, and as we look to really promote the comprehensive nature of the plan going forward in March, there'll be further refinement with the public through more events, the use of tools that I'm just starting to learn about, deliberation platforms and other places where the public can rank and vote on strategies and policies. And we'll be thinking continually about how we do better and work with the public. So that's where we are. And I'll turn it back over to Ed to just bring home the points of where the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the Climate Action Plan overlap and where they differ.
Great, thanks, Jane. So as you could hear from Jane's explanation, there's an enormous amount of overlap. We're really trying to work as closely as possible on this. Climate Action Plan has a couple things that the CEP has never really considered. Sequestration, adaptation, we've sort of talked about, but never in great detail. And then non-energy related GHG and then also looking at the Ghg inventory that ANR's air quality division maintains. Those are things that the CEP is not doing, but for the most part, we're looking at overall cost-effective GHG reductions, trying to do a thorough analysis of different pathways and scenarios. Public engagement as well has been very important to the CEP, and Jane laid out nicely the massive effort that Climate Council is doing. This is the best effort I've seen in the 20 years I've been involved in the state in terms of outreach to the public, and a focus on equity as well. And that's something that we're trying to develop in greater detail in the CEP as well. So I'm going to leave it at that and ask if there's any questions at this point. I'll turn it over to Cindy.
So yeah, if you have questions about the energy plan and how it relates to the climate plan, please raise your hand. And Philip, can you monitor the? So I'll give a couple more minutes, and then we'll shift to the equity discussion. So do we have any questions about the interrelation of the two plans? Okay, so hearing none, I'm going to pass it back to Ed for a state of the state discussion.
Great, thanks, Cindy. I recognize we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly. This is really, I do also want to flag this for Chad and Liz, who have been helping out plan this entire thing. So as I finish up, I'd invite you two to make any corrections or additional statements that you would like to make. I'm trying to do this in the neutralest way as possible. So this is just general overview. Statutory context. Already mentioned state energy policy. There's additional to that affordability, reliability, sustainability. There's also in statute renewable energy goals. Support development of jobs, economic development associated with renewable infrastructure, provide incentives for long-term, stably priced renewable contracts, and encourage diversity in plant capacity and type. So basically the size and resource type. Next slide. I already mentioned least cost planning, how the electric energy plan has to be based on this. I see it as basically meet GWSA requirements, provide reliable grid, lowest reasonable cost. Reasonable, not the lowest cost, lowest reasonable. Next slide. I'm just going to go over quickly some of the programs that we have for renewable generation, some recent, past, and existing. The reason I'm touching on the recent past, there was a SPEED program in 2005, required utilities to enter into long-term stably priced contracts. Importantly, did not require retirement of RECs. It was not similar to RPS, renewable portfolio standards in other states. But basically, the utilities went out, and a lot of the resources we now have within Vermont were built as a result of SPEED. 140 megawatts of wind, about 11 megawatts of landfill gas, and 11 megawatts of hydro were all built during this time period. In 2015, it was replaced with the renewable energy standard, but those resources are still all there. Next slide. Standard offer program created in 2009. This is really focused on distributed generation. There's a recognition that the SPEED program wasn't producing any small scale resources. So the idea was a centralized statewide procurement for resources 2.2 megawatts or less. There's a cap of 127.5 megawatts that was set in 2012. The program does not actually require the retirement of RECs, so some of the early projects built don't fit well within RES, which I'll talk about in a second. Yeah, and so the last thing on this, the standard offer program has a certain number of megawatts that are put out by offer by the PUC every year. This program is actually scheduled to end or will have fulfilled its 127.5 megawatts in the near term. Slide, please. So net metering has been around since 1999. It's had a large number of changes. I'm not going to walk through all of them. 2008 was when group net metering opened up. The most significant change was 2011. There was a solar adder recognizing the value at the time of solar to reduce peak and capacity costs and transmission costs. So you can see this, we actually started at 1% cap in 1999, increased to 15% cap in 2014. At this point, there is no cap, and some utilities, I think, have close to 30% of their peak load is met by net metering. And it wasn't until 2017 that net metering started explicitly linking the compensation for net metering as to whether or not the RECs are given to the utility or transferred to the utility. So projects prior to 2017, those resources are not really captured within the existing renewable energy standard. Next slide. This shows the installations. The orange is new installations for each year, and there's the cumulative as well. So you can see that the probably the highest amount of new installations was 2016, and that has declined to some extent over time. Next slide. Renewable energy standard is basically an RPS. It's what most other states call that. So this was passed in 2015, took effect in 2017. Tier 1 is total renewable, basically no limitations on the size of any renewable plants, the age when the plant was constructed, or the location, provided it's delivering energy into New England. It started at 55% of load, increases to 75% of load in 2032. An important part of RES or any RPS is that it's a percentage of load, so it will keep up with electrification. If you set a requirement based on a percentage of load, it means that as you add more electric vehicles, more heat pumps, you need to add more renewable generation to meet the RPS or the RES. Tier 2 of the RES is distributed generation, much more limited than Tier 1, must be located within Vermont, under 5 megawatts and built after June 30th, 2015. It's up to 10% of load in 2032. Tier 3, I'm not really going to talk about energy transformation. The important point here is that utilities are offering heat pumps, EVs, doing weatherization, doing all sorts of innovative stuff to encourage reduction in customers' fossil fuel usage, and a lot of that is overlapping with electrification efforts as well. Next slide. This is just a graphical depiction. The blue is the Tier 1 total energy, and the green, the smaller green, is the distributed generation component. The black line on the top is the retail sales that we project as well. So you can see the gap between essentially the top of the green bar and that black line. Next slide. So quick overview of existing resources. Energy efficiency, always considered the first fuel. We're not actually talking about energy efficiency in the context of resources. We're talking more today about renewable energy standard and what a 100% RES could look like to help inform the Climate Council discussion, CEP discussion. I just wanted to note, part of the reason we're not talking about energy efficiency, every 3 years, the PUC sets the budgets and quantitative performance indicators for Burlington Electric Department and Efficiency Vermont as well. Those efficiency programs have had a significant impact on the total number of kilowatt hours needed by Vermonters. Next slide. So in terms of generation located within Vermont, first I want to note that we're part of ISO New England. We're part of a regional context. We rely on a regional grid to provide power 24/7. However, we do have a fair amount of generation within the state, and this is only the renewable generation. 400 megawatts of distributed solar, 200 megawatts of hydro. And I'll say that solar, it's about 95% of it came into service in the last 10 years. 200 megawatts of hydro, the vast majority of that was, some of it was over 130 years ago. A few smaller plants have just come into service fairly recently. There's about 150 megawatts of wind within the state. Majority of that came into service in the last 15 years. Biomass, there's 2 plants, McNeil and Burlington, and then Reigate. Those were built in, I think, the late 80s, mid to late 80s, early 90s for both of those. Landfill gas, Moortown and Coventry, those came into service about 15 years ago, and a number of small anaerobic methane digesters, most of those also in the last 15 years or so. Next slide. So there's the physical energy that's delivered to customers, and then there's the renewable energy credits. Those are not always the same. On the left-hand side, it shows the mix of our utilities' power supply portfolios. This is a statewide average. Each utility is different. Green Mountain Power is the majority of about 75% of the load or so. So this is a little bit skewed more towards Green Mountain Power. Burlington Electric and Washington Electric and a few others are going to look vastly different. But for the most part, roughly a little under a third of our power is met with nuclear, large amount through HQ, existing hydro, wind, relatively small amount through the system mix, in other words, through ISO New England as well. If you look at the right-hand pie chart, this is the renewable energy credits. So this is essentially the percentage of renewable credits associated with load. And you can see, and sorry, this isn't just RECs. This is HQ is a large portion, other hydro, solar is a significant, and this is covering tier 2 requirement. There's still a fair amount of system mix or ISO New England, and then also nuclear as well. So in terms of compliance, you can see that on the left-hand side, tier 1 is met almost entirely with hydro. So Hydro-Quebec, other hydro. NYPA we called out, that's New York Power Authority, Niagara and St. Lawrence hydro projects. Small amount of biomass, small amount of solar are used for compliance. For tier 2 or the distributed generation, I think there's a labeling mistake on there. The left-hand side is net metering, which is just about half. Also solar, but non-net metering is also just about half, and then a relatively small amount of new hydro makes up the rest. Next slide. A couple system considerations. You need to provide power. People want the power when they turn on the switch, they want it to be delivered. So you have to think about when is power produced, when is it used? These are different. Each season is going to look slightly different during the day. The top is the winter time. We use more electricity in Vermont in the winter. So that top blue line is the winter. Summer, solar has had a significant impact on the seasonal load or the daily load for everything pretty much except for winter, and it actually has had an impact on winter as well. But you can see in the summertime, now our peak is actually after dark. And that's the gray line, the second line down. The next line is a nice spring day, and this must be a cloudy day because it's actually not showing that dip in the middle of the day when you'd have solar production. And then the fall shows a typical solar production, a good solar production day. You have a little bit of a ramp in the morning, dips down considerably during the daytime when all the solar is producing, and then comes back up towards dark or after dark. Going forward, electrification. This shows heat pumps, basically. ISO New England is looking at what kind of load do we need to meet heat pumps and EVs. So this simply shows heat pump expected loads. The forecast, you can see it's all basically in the wintertime. So we're adding a lot of wintertime load associated with heat pumps. Next slide. A lot of overall load associated with EVs tends to be more load associated with EVs in the wintertime than during the rest of the year, just due to the efficiency of the batteries. And then the last thing I just want to touch on quickly, I think it's worth anybody taking a look at the Velcro long-range transmission plan. They've done a lot of work. It's flagging a concern. It's not saying, it's saying that if we keep building out PV the way that we have in the past, we're going to run into some system concerns. And you can mitigate those by thinking about where is solar deployed, load management, and battery storage as well. So there's different considerations. It's not, the long-range transmission plan is not saying this is, we need to stop all solar. It's saying we need to think about the siting of it and how we actually deploy it going forward. That's what I have. Sorry, that took a little longer than I thought. And Chad or Liz, is there anything that you want to throw in?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, that was great, Ed. Thank you. I guess the only thing I would throw in is so that folks understand that, we're considering 10, 15, 20 years out. And, I think we need to recognize that renewable energy with respect to the concept of least cost. We just need to be ready for a time when renewables may be least cost. That's not today, that's not tomorrow, but it's on the horizon. And, it's something that we're thinking about. So that speaks to, as Ed was mentioning just on that last slide, that speaks to transmission deployment, transmission line deployment, that speaks to storage, that speaks to controls. So just so that folks know that we are, in fact, thinking about that, at least on the Climate Council side, I should clarify. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. That was really helpful. I should have noted as well that there's been really significant, just in the last 10 years, been significant declines in the price of the installed cost of solar and battery storage as well. And we're still seeing not quite as steep declines, but we're still seeing declining costs. So Chad's completely right. We're seeing more parity when we think about a least cost perspective. So turn over to Cindy.
And I'm going to turn it over to Claire to introduce the speakers regarding equity.
Excuse me, there were questions.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
Claire,
Sorry. We have
okay.
an opportunity for questions. So do people have questions about what you've just heard? So if you do, raise your hand, please.
Questions are in chat. I think that might be the easiest way to do it.
Yes. And
So-
Philip, can you help me with that?
Sure. So there's Jeff Ford asked, are societal costs and externalities included in least cost planning?
So Jeff, the answer is yes. It's not explicitly, I only put in portions of the statute. The statute actually does say, looking at overall societal costs has considerations associated with the environmental, how you provide economic values for the environmental as well. So the answer is yes.
And I'm going to run through the chat questions before turning it to the questioners who want to speak themselves, just to clear it out. Matt Burke asked, how are energy service needs defined in statute or in the CEP?
And I don't think energy service, sorry, I think of like energy service companies. Energy service needs is essentially another way of defining that is ensuring that customers can flick the switch, plug in their EV, and they get the power when they need it. I think that might be what the question is about, but can ask for clarification later.
James Moore asks about the assumptions included around the heat pump and electric vehicle deployment in those charts, and asks, would the assumed deployment levels get us to the needed greenhouse gas reductions?
Yep, great question, James. That was ISO New England. It was all the states working with ISO New England. And the short answer is no, that we're definitely going to need more heat pumps and more EVs. The EV assumptions in particular were fairly low. This was one of the first iterations that ISO New England did of electrification forecast, EV forecast, which has been very difficult. I think everybody's got their own EV forecast. At the end of the day, yeah, we're definitely going to need more EVs than what is shown in those graphs, and more heat pumps as well.
Next is a question from GMG, and I'd encourage that person to rename themselves so we know who that is. But the question is, does the planning process anticipate renewing Hydro-Quebec contracts at higher prices, given more demand from other ISO New England states, as the Hydro-Quebec contracts expire over the planning period?
Yeah, good question. So most of the HQ contracts, I believe, go until 2033 or so, 2034, somewhere in that time period. Department is not saying these specific providers of electricity, in other words, not saying you need to provide or buy from HQ versus NYPA versus Brookfield, which owns a bunch of hydro, or any specific provider. So instead it would be, what we're looking at doing is, how do you design a renewable energy standard to get the attributes that you want? And then the utilities would then go out and procure the resources with some review, depending on the size of the contract, by the PUC and the Department of Public Service.
Thank you. And GMG is George Gross. Thanks for the clarification. And James Gibbons, I'll go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick general comments, particularly around terminology. I've heard terminology being kind of thrown around pretty aggressively here, like load being used in relation to the RES when in fact it's retail sales. That leaves company use and losses off the table if you're talking about retail sales. I've heard sort of clean, renewable, carbon reducing, and green all used as if they're interchangeable. And I'm not certain that we have a shared understanding of that. And Ed, could you go back to your slide with the megawatts by resource, please? I would strongly encourage on any slide like this that you attach the megawatt hours by resource as well, because I really think we need to keep track of energy, not nameplate capacity, if we're attempting to meet Vermont's energy needs. Those are just some general comments and suggestions, as we go forward. And I don't know that we need to try to address the terminology today, but it's going to start to become important, I think.
Great, thanks, James.
And George, your hand is still up. I don't know if you have a question or if it was answered already.
I did have a question, if that's available.
Okay.
So most of the conversation has treated renewable energy as being equal to zero greenhouse gas emissions, but in fact, that's not really true, especially if we do a life cycle assessment of the different, in particular, I'm thinking of hydroelectric reservoirs and of course, biomass. Both have life cycles emissions over their lifespan, and they're not necessarily zero. They're gray wrecks, if you will. In fact, arguably, you could look at any of the energy sources we have and say they have some emissions associated with their life cycle. So has there been any discussion or planned discussion to look at the RES as maybe being more accurately or more on target if it was directed at zero emissions as the goal state? We may never achieve that goal, but in fact, if we look at all these different resources through the lens of how much do they emit over their lifespan in carbon or other gases, that would give us a much more accurate portrait of how clean our energy mix is than the current scheme, which assumes all renewable energy is zero emissions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, George. So in the Climate Council context, the Science and Data Subcommittee they're working with Cadmus and Energy Futures Group to do a review of the Ghg inventory that ANR maintains. I believe we expect to have recommendations related to how to treat hydro and other resources in there. And the department would be looking very heavily at what that has to say and how that helps inform a RES design as well. And that is something that we want to talk about a little bit farther along, starting a little after lunchtime or afternoon. So thanks.
And there are two more questions from the chat, which I'll put together. So Ben Gordeski asks about how Hydro-Quebec carbon emissions are considered, given emissions from flooded land and the creation of reservoirs. And James Moore asks also about Hydro-Quebec, asking just about the lifespan used for the new Hydro-Quebec infrastructure when calculating greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And I would just say the same response as how I just responded to George on that. There's currently a review looking at Hydro-Quebec in the Climate Council context. And we'll be looking at that.
And I see Ken Nolan has raised his hand. Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. I'm just curious, I mean, the word affordability has been used a couple of times, but I haven't heard it really discussed in any of the slides. I'm curious as to how the analysis that's going on is factoring in the cost for implementing some of these programs. In particular, I'm thinking about active control costs, utility infrastructure cost upgrades. Is that part of the conversation here in the analysis, the LEAP analysis, or anything else that's being done?
I don't believe that it's actually being incorporated into the LEAP analysis. I don't think we get into that level of granularity there. TJ can correct me if I'm wrong if he's on. But that is definitely a consideration that load management is not something that you just buy off the shelf necessarily. It takes some time and some effort to develop as well. So fully recognize that moving towards a distributed future is going to result in additional costs as we try to manage load and intermittent generation more heavily. So I completely agree, Ken, that there's costs associated with it.
Well, in that
We don't have
context,
particular.
I would just encourage that folks consider low tech options, and the fact that we don't necessarily need to move directly to active control of everything. There are steps that can be taken without major investments, and I'm getting the impression from these presentations that's not really being discussed.
Yep, understood. And I will also say that the departments, when we think about least cost planning, we don't think of you pick the lowest cost option and always apply it. You look at a portfolio. And so I think some direct load control, some storage, finding the resources that deliver when electricity is required, all those are different factors that need to be thrown into the mix. But thank you, Ken.
There are
So
two more raised hands, but we are 13 minutes past. So I guess I just ask, Cindy, do you want to hear the two, or do you want to ask them to comment in the chat?
Let's, if they're brief informational questions or comments, let's go with those and check with the phone and then move on.
Okay, James Moore.
Great, thanks. I guess if this is the venue to make a request or a recommendation, I appreciate that the data committee is looking at the GHG questions. I would recommend or ask that they kind of look at new hydro differently than older vintage hydro, based on the fact that as we look at the most severe climate impacts and trying to limit greenhouse gas output over the next 1 or 2 decades being of paramount import, the idea of using anything like a 100-year life cycle on new hydro is selling us short.
Thanks, James. And there's one more question or comment?
Yes, from Carrick. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This is Garrick. Excellent presentation. It was nice going down memory lane there a bit, Ed, so thank you for that. Quick question, please. I'm trying to understand, given at least what's one of the things top of mind for me, where we have a conflict between regional wholesale markets versus in-state policy and desire, namely SHEI, the Sheffield-Highgate interface. May I please, could you just give me a sense of where the council, where the comprehensive energy plan, where the region and the fact we're part of a regional grid ends, and where Vermont, what is the jurisdiction limit, or how are you incorporating what makes sense for Vermont to accomplish completely within our state, mindful of the fact that we're part of a regional grid? I don't think that's very artfully articulated, but I think you get the drift of what I'm trying to understand.
Is that something that's a longer conversation, Ed, that you and Carrick could have offline?
I will do a very, very quick summary because it's not a quick question. And that is essentially, yes, in thinking about a renewable energy standard, we need to think about both in-state economic development, in-state generation for lots of different reasons, including resilience, some of the co-benefits Jane had mentioned earlier in her test, or when she was describing some of the goals of the Climate Council. So we need to look at the in-state requirements. We also need to look at what does Vermont as a participant in the region as a whole, how are we contributing to ensure that the lights stay on in the region that we're a part of all year round 8760? And Carrick, happy to talk offline.
Okay, so do we have any people that are joining us by phone that have questions? So if you're on the phone, you need to press *6 to unmute. So I'll give you a minute. No, okay. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Claire to introduce the presenters about equity.
Thanks, Cindy. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Nadia, who's our first presenter, maybe as I introduce the session, you could bring up your slides, just so we keep things moving efficiently. But for those who don't know me, my name is Claire McElveny. I'm a Senior Energy Policy and Program Analyst with the Planning Division of the Department. I also serve as staff support for the Just Transitions and Science and Data Subcommittee of the Climate Council, so supporting their work in this area. And as Nadia brings up her slides, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for this session as we move into it. For those of you who have been following the Climate Council process as part of their commitment to centering equity in our work, they've been holding space at the beginning of each of their council meetings to sort of reflect on how equity considerations play into the work of the council. And developing this workshop, we wanted to continue with that practice. So we've invited two speakers, Nadia Marquez-Pabst, who I'll let introduce herself shortly, and also Alicia Gutierrez, who's with the California Energy Commission, to help us do that. And I'm hoping that they will bring up some really good points about how we can think about incorporating equity considerations into our decision-making criteria, about how we think about policies and programs, and also into policies and programs themselves. And I would just hope that we can take the presentations and then the subsequent discussion that we have created space for in this session into the afternoon with us, as we're sort of diving deeper into the technical weeds of where we might go with our renewable energy standard and other programs and policies in Vermont in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nadia. Yeah.
Great, and I'm just loading it. Can everyone see my screen?
We are seeing it in presenter mode. So I think at the top, maybe if you hit the swap displays. Great, you are all set.
Great, thanks, Claire, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me as we dive into this complex and urgent issue of equity in the electrical sector. I am very happy to be here today. And before jumping in, I wanted to provide a quick roadmap of today's presentation. We'll kick off with a brief overview of who I am and how I got here. We'll then dive into a baseline understanding for what is equity and the factors that can increase climate vulnerability. We'll then look at equity in practice through the California Public Utility Commission's Self-Generation Incentive Program, also known as SGIP. And we'll dive from there into action item suggestions by looking at 7 steps for building equity into policy design as presented by the state of Washington, and then equity as dimensions of environmental justice in policy design efforts. So who am I? Again, my name is Nadia Marquez-Pabst, and I have spent most of my career working on policy and regulatory design for new, disruptive, and green technologies on the federal, state, and local levels of government. Most recently, I worked at Cruise Automation as our head of U.S. government relations. Cruise is an all-electric self-driving car company with multi-billion-dollar investments from both Honda and General Motors. I also worked at NextEra Energy and Florida Power and Light in the capacity of federal governmental affairs. You might know them as the nation's largest electric utility and the largest renewables developer in the world. And then finally, I also worked at Advanced Microgrid Solutions, which is an advanced AI software company that focuses on distributed energy resources. And at the time that I was with the company, they were a developer of storage plus renewables and their integration to the grid. So let's dive in. What is equity? As we all know, the transition to lower carbon sources of energy will inevitably lead to, and oftentimes perpetuates, pre-existing sets of winners and losers. The winners are those who benefit from cleaner energy sources, reduced emissions, and employment and innovation opportunities of this transition. The losers, on the other hand, are those who bear the burdens or lack of access to these opportunities. So when we talk about equity in the space of environment, energy, and climate, there are so many challenges to resolve. And each community here in Vermont will define what equity means on an individual basis. So to get to a broad sense, I'll quote from the Initiative for Energy Justice, which defines equity in the following 3 ways. Number 1, it is the recognition and remediation of the disproportionately high and adverse human or health or environmental impacts on low income and communities of color. 2, it's achieving both social and economic participation in the energy system while remediating social, economic, and health burdens of those historically harmed by the energy system. And then finally, 3 is the remediation of the impacts of climate change on poor or underserved communities and compensation for harms suffered by such communities due to climate change. Today, we are confronted with the reality that if the system weren't broken, if it were in fact equitable, we wouldn't be trying to resolve for it today. And studies have substantiated that environmental disparities that we see in BIPOC communities, BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color, includes increased air pollution, water contamination, and flooding. Health disparities include increased rates of asthma, cancer, heart attacks, infectious diseases, infant mortality rates, and heat stress. And communities at the greatest risk of these hazards are also more likely to be under 185% of the federal poverty level, according to the EPA. So you'll dive in and you'll find the figures astounding. And some of the contributing factors are listed here. These include racism, income, living conditions, age, location, occupation, health disparities, and language barriers. So now that we have kind of a base level understanding of what equity is and some of the driving factors, if you will, for climate vulnerability, I wanted to turn to a real world example of equity in policy design. And for this discussion, we're going to turn to the Self-Generation Incentive Program. This program has gone through multiple iterations in its pursuit of equity. It's still going through the iterative process. And that's why I think it's a really great example for purposes of today's discussion. SGIP is administered by the California Public Utilities Commission by 4 different program administrators. These include PG&E, SoCal Gas, SoCal Edison, and the Center for Sustainable Energy. It provides an upfront rebate for distributed energy resources, or DERs. And since the program inception, it's had over $1 billion in funding. And oftentimes it's considered an early stage mover in equity policy for the state of California. In its early stages of the program, funds were administered on a first come, first served basis, and priority was largely limited to the vulnerable grid areas and geographic localities within the state of California. In 2017, the California Public Utilities Commission realized that there was a great opportunity and a great need to redesign the program to allow for equity. And so they created some goals in 2017 around disadvantaged communities. And the focus here was to spur economic and workforce development for disadvantaged communities, to reduce conventional, if not eliminate the need for gas facilities, and to allow energy storage to be accessible for low-income customers, nonprofits, and public sector organizations. In that 2017 decision, we saw 25% of available SGIP funding designated for the equity budget. That's approximately $55 million. It had strict definitions for what equity budget eligibility looked like. It covered some, but not all the costs of the DER that was being applied for. And 10% of the funding was for single and multi-family low-income housing. And this is all great. In 2019, the commission looked at the equity budget and said, shucks, we have $55 million that remains untouched. So in 2019, the commission reevaluated the program, issued a rulemaking, and then a decision to establish an equity resiliency budget. The goal here was to really target and allow for accessibility within disadvantaged communities and to utilize the funding that had been made available under the equity budget. It allocated $100 million to this equity resiliency budget, $14 million to equity in the capacity of heat pump water heaters, $10 million to the vulnerable community of the San Joaquin Valley. And we fast forward to today, and most of the funding across the 4 different program administrators has been accounted for. And this is largely due to broadened eligibility requirements for low income and disadvantaged communities, a really generous incentive rate, and ultimately an opportunity to have up to 100% of equipment costs covered through the program. And yet, despite multiple program iterations of SGIP in addressing and deliberately prioritizing equity, there remains work to be done. So as we see today, as I mentioned, we have roughly 100% of fundings that have been reserved through the SGIP program. And when you dive in, when you look at the SGIP weekly statewide report, you realize that over 90% of the funds that have been accounted for are not in fact delivered to the CalEnviroScreen census tract. And the CalEnviroScreen, for context, it identifies California communities by census tract that are disproportionately burdened by and vulnerable to multiple sources of pollution. And you look at every decision that comes from the CPUC on SGIP, this is how they're defining disadvantaged communities. And again, upwards of 98% aren't going to these communities. And a lot of this is the challenges that we see in policy design and failing to meet people where they are. Some examples of this are listed here. Energy and financial literacy within low income and disadvantaged communities is critical. Most individuals in these communities don't understand the costs, the benefits, or the needs and the environmental impact, frankly, of a battery or rooftop solar. There's a need for financial literacy to ensure that just launching the program doesn't mean that it's actually affordable. They can't need to fundamentally understand their ability to engage in this. There are housing and development constraints. Many members of this community simply don't have enough rooftop space for a solar array. Many don't have a backyard or garage that allows for a large energy storage system to be installed. And a sensitivity to that would actually be an opportunity for this program to address the equity needs that present themselves. Also, there's social perceptions as it relates to class and education, and money can't be the central driver. If money is made available, individuals need to know that it is available specifically for them, how to access that, and how to engage in the application process. On the right here, I have my what if wish list, if you will. I'm going to dive into this very briefly because I think the following slides actually provide a more substantive approach on how to address this. But what if at the end of the day, the policy process actually designated seats at the table for members of the disadvantaged and low-income communities to engage and to feel validated in the process? What if the entire policy process were accessible and intuitive to everyone, or the scope of outreach really targeted those areas of most need and the engagement opportunities were both income and culturally sensitive? And then finally, I'll speak on behalf of the rulemaking process before the California Public Utilities Commission. It's not super intuitive, and there are linguistic barriers in terms of engaging members of the disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. There's the time and day in which rulemakings and workshops are being held. The duration of rulemaking is often 18 months. That's a lot to ask for individuals to participate. And then the technological barriers that might exist and the rules for engaging in comments. At least in California, it has to be a certain format, a certain number of words, and then it has to be in PDF-A format before you can even submit it. And that's a barrier for many people. So now what? Let's talk about building equity into policy design. And in doing so, I want to look at the 7-step process that's outlined here and borrowed from the Washington Department of Commerce and their statewide equity initiatives. Here, the applicability of each step to any particular energy policy or program obviously is going to vary, but I find this to be a very useful tool in evaluating clean energy policies and programs and using these metrics to ensure equitable policy and programmatic design. So number one is to ensure equitable access to economic benefits and opportunity by empowering communities. What this means is policy must be informed by local knowledge. It has to meet local needs, and it has to be viewed as legitimate by the local community. Whenever possible, you have to provide enhanced technical assistance to facilitate involvement of smaller communities and organizations. And the system has to have the capacity to consult with and include communities, and community members must have a seat at the table in designing programs and selecting projects. Number two, we must ensure universal and equitable access to remote, affordable service options. If there's one thing COVID has elucidated, is the opportunities to engage remotely in the policymaking process. However, many members of the disadvantaged communities and those who identify as low income don't necessarily have access to the technology in order to engage remotely. And that has to be something that's considered if you want to address equity. Number three, you have to center program design on the reduction of energy cost burdens. This is achieved by focusing on cost burden as a metric in planning. Number four is to incorporate health disparity metrics into energy planning. Number five, increase resiliency and energy sovereignty for tribes and energy independence for vulnerable communities. Six is address procedural inequities in program design and prioritize equitable development. And then finally, number seven is to address the nexus of issues as it relates to affordable housing, livable communities, and displacement in energy policy. And this can be achieved largely through consultation with housing policy experts. Another way to ensure that a policy or program is equitably designed is to evaluate by the three dimensions of energy and environmental justice. These are procedural equity, distributional equity, and structural equity. And in the interest of time, I'll just touch on each of these lightly. For procedural equity, it's about creating processes that are transparent, fair, and inclusive in developing and implementing any program, plan, or policy. Distributional equity means to fairly distribute resources, benefits, and burdens. And structural equity means to make a commitment to correct past harms and prevent future unintended consequences, and to address underlying structural and institutional systems that are the root causes of social and racial inequities. And then finally, as Jane mentioned earlier, there is a great amount of work that's being done within the Vermont Climate Council as it relates to a just transition. And some of the products that they have produced as part of their work here is a list of impacted and frontline communities here in Vermont. And I think that's a fantastic resource if you want to evaluate which stakeholders need to be involved and how and who needs to be targeted through energy policies. And finally, it also sets out guidelines for prioritizing environmental justice and equity in the state as we move towards the zero carbon future. And with that, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nadia. That was really helpful, both in terms of setting context and giving us some concrete examples to think through. Alicia, if you are able to, invite you to share your screen and slides. And as I mentioned in the chat, the format for this will let Alicia present and then have the rest of the time for we'll have Cindy start off with a couple of prompt questions to keep us thinking and then open the floor for open discussion. And I think, Cindy, we can go just a little bit past our scheduled end at 11:45, just since we were running a little bit behind schedule, but we will still have a break. We won't take that away. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Alicia.
Good morning, everyone. Still pretty early on the West Coast. My name is Alicia Gutierrez. I am the Deputy Director for the California Energy Commission's Energy Assessment Division. And today I'm going to be presenting on the SB 100 work that we published in March of this year. SB 100 establishes a policy that is the eligible renewable and zero carbon resources supply 100% of all retail sales in electricity procured to serve state loads by 2045. It's a mouthful, but it seems very similar to me, just in my very basic understanding of Vermont school, where we're not talking about state loads and or certain types of loads. It also expands the RPS to 60% by 2030 and requires the Energy Commission, Public Utilities Commission, and Air Resources Board to use existing programs like the one that Nadia just mentioned to achieve a policy and issue issue a joint SB 100 report every 4 years. So our next one, it will be coming out in 2025. Before I go ahead, I wanted to highlight that equity was brought to the surface in the implementation of this report and development of the report. In California, we have a focus on a clean energy future for all, equitable transition for all. And if I'm trying to draw some nexuses between what Vermont is putting together, again, based on my very basic understanding and the presentations given this morning, I would equate the ARB scoping plan to the climate action plan and the joint agency SB 100 report to the comprehensive energy plan. So we're looking at the 2045 timeframe, but there's lots of targets in the meantime. Okay, so SB 100 is central to achieving the state's goal of an economy-wide carbon neutrality using clean electricity to increasingly power transportation, buildings, and industrial operations, helping decarbonize these sectors, which, along with electricity generation, account for 92% of the state's total carbon emissions. So similar to Vermont, transportation makes up a large share of our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And you can see industrial is another large customer. And that is one that we, like probably other states, are having a difficult time finding ways to decarbonize. But hopefully by decarbonizing the electricity sector, we can start to see some reductions economy-wide. So in addition to serving as a key pillar in the state's efforts to mitigate climate change, SB 100 can benefit residents across the state by improving public health, primarily in reductions in criteria air pollution, as clean resources replace fossil fuel in generating electricity. Also by advancing energy equity by moving towards that 100% target in ways that help ensure equitable outcomes, such as alleviating the public health burden in disadvantaged communities where a disproportionate number of the state's fossil gas plants are located. And it also supports the clean energy economy by helping restore thousands of clean energy jobs lost during the pandemic and creating many more high quality jobs and career pathways. So this report is a very first step to evaluate the challenges and opportunities in achieving 100% clean electricity by 2045. It includes an initial assessment of the additional energy resources and the resource build rates needed to achieve the goal, along with an initial assessment of associated costs. It's important to note that the estimates in this report are intended to serve as a foundation for future work and will change over time as additional factors such as system reliability, land use, energy equity, and workforce needs are more closely examined. The report was informed by a diverse array of interest over a year of public workshops, including scoping workshops that we held across the state. As Nadia mentioned, we also hold them typically during work hours and try to do them at locations where people can access and have free parking, and there's public transportation access and things like that. But we've heard loud and clear that from the community-based organizations that having after-hour options, having virtual formats is actually working well and allowing people access to proceedings and workshops that they might not have normally had access to when we hold them in our state capitol. And then meeting people where they are in their communities has been very effective in drawing both the representative organizations and people out. But I know we have work to do there. So the agencies also consulted with the California Balancing Authorities as required by the statute and Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group, which is a group that advises both the California Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission on energy equity issues. The engagement with both of these groups, as well as public and other stakeholders was key in informing the process and recommendations for the SB 100 work. So we also made some changes mid-process as a result of comments coming from the community-based organizations. One of those was to model a no combustion scenario, which I'll get into a little bit later, and then focusing on non-energy benefits for all of the portfolios and considering those in selecting a portfolio. We didn't select a portfolio in this process. Instead, we just presented results, but I'll speak a little bit about that in just a minute. So getting into the technical work, we modeled renewable and zero carbon resources to meet our clean electricity needs. In order to qualify, these resources must be either RPS eligible or have zero on-site greenhouse gas emissions. For our core scenarios, we only included commercialized technologies with publicly available and vetted cost and performance data. Specifically, these resources included new and existing solar photovoltaic, existing solar thermal, new and existing onshore wind, and new offshore wind, new and existing geothermal, new and existing bioenergy, new green hydrogen fuel cells, existing small and large hydro facilities, and existing nuclear power plants. This list will continue to be updated in the future as emerging technologies mature and come to market and data becomes available. Okay, so this will give you some idea of scale. What our modeling results told us was that in order to meet our SB 100 goals, while electrifying large portions of the rest of the economy, California will need to roughly triple its current electric grid capacity. On this slide, we see the projected new clean energy resources in comparison to the clean energy resources already on the California grid today. So looking at 2045, the SB 100 modeling projected that we'll need nearly 70 gigawatts of new utility scale solar, nearly 30 gigawatts of new customer solar, nearly 50 gigawatts of battery storage, 4 gigawatts of long duration storage, 12.6 gigawatts of onshore wind, 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, and 100 megawatts of geothermal. All of this in order to meet our 100% renewable and zero carbon electricity target by 2045. And then these resources are projected to increase annual costs by about 6% over the 60% RPS baseline scenario in 2045. Okay, so now to build rates. In order to achieve this massive build out of renewable energy and storage resources, this will require sustained record-setting build rates through 2045, including a tripling of solar and wind build rates from our 10-year historic average, and an 8-fold increase in battery build rates from 2020. So Jane alluded to the shot Vermont has to get things right due to the long lead times. This is something that California is facing right now because we understand that these types of utility scale projects take 10 years to from design and permitting to actually operating. We are doing some exploratory transmission studies with our CAISO, California Independent System Operator, to look at what is going to be needed for the longer term, and that goes beyond their 10-year transmission study process. So in addition to modeling meeting our core SB 100 scenario, the joint agencies explored sensitivities as well as several scenarios outside of the scope of SB 100. One of these sensitivities was a high demand flexibility scenario that included 6 gigawatts of load flexibility. This additional flexibility resulted in less batteries, increased gas plant retirements, and lower overall costs compared to the SB 100 core scenario. The joint agencies also modeled several study scenarios outside of the scope of SB 100 that are intended to inform broader state planning efforts on energy, climate, and public health. These included the no combustion scenario that I mentioned earlier, where all combustion resources, including gas-fired power plants, will retire by 2045. And this was a specific request of our environmental and environmental justice organizations. The initial results indicated that this scenario would increase annual costs by about 12% in 2045 compared to the SB 100 core scenario. So here are some of the key takeaways from modeling. We found that initial modeling shows that SB 100 is technically achievable through multiple pathways. Construction must be sustained at record-setting rates. Diversity in energy resources and technologies lowers overall costs. And retaining some natural gas power capacity may minimize costs while ensuring uninterrupted power supply in our transition. And then increased energy storage and advancements in zero carbon technologies can reduce natural gas capacity needs. And we also found that further analysis is needed. And I'll get into that right now. So we are verifying that this is what we need to still do, but we're kind of in the process of implementation and starting some of this work now. So we need to verify that scenario results satisfy the state's grid reliability requirements. So that's something that we're actually starting to explore, and we'll likely be covering that in a workshop in the next few months. We need to continue to evaluate the potential of emerging resources such as offshore wind, long duration energy storage, and green hydrogen technologies, also demand flexibility. And then of course, assessing environmental, social, and economic costs and benefits. So that is the non-energy benefits that I spoke to earlier, and also suggestion from our environmental and environmental justice community-based organizations. And then we are planning to hold annual workshops to support alignment between the joint agencies with their proceedings. So the Air Resources Board is currently hosting workshops on their scoping plan development process. And we also work closely with CPUC on their integrated resource planning process. So all of these processes together will kind of fall under the SB 100 reports, and we need to acknowledge the work that's happening in these other agencies along the way. So SB 100 and implementation activities, I alluded to this. We are conducting additional analyses and hosting workshops this summer on land use and transmission considerations for expanded renewable rollout with the objective of identifying least regrets investments. So this Thursday, we're hosting a workshop where we're going to be talking about some of the scenarios and presenting resource maps on where those resources can be built to avoid environmental conflicts and ideally put them in, well, least regrets builds. So we're also providing, as I mentioned, information to the California Independent System Operator to inform an exploratory transmission study that looks beyond the typical 10-year planning horizon. And in a separate but related effort, California is beginning to look at gas plant retirements. In our core SB 100 scenario, we started to see retirements of gas plants representing about 14% of our state's capacity around 2040. State's gas capacity. And then through the Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group and multiple public workshops, California energy agencies continue to engage with environmental justice representatives as we think about SB 100 implementation and the information needed to make sound decisions. So land use considerations, this is what we are endeavoring to do. So looking at landscape scale planning to identify opportunities where development will reduce adverse effects, and then considering trade-offs, including carbon sequestration by natural and working lands. So these are priorities for us, and we have a pretty robust siting team that that does really good work in this area, and they'll be presenting the information on Thursday. And then societal cost and non-energy benefits. So environmental and EJ organizations submitted comments through our process to prioritize land use impacts, public health and air quality, water supply and quality, economic impacts, and resilience when considering non-energy benefits. And currently we're researching and evaluating frameworks to consider non-energy benefits, and we'll ideally integrate them into modeling for the next report. But we will also be having a workshop on this topic probably in the fall timeframe. So I'd be happy to share that. And if people have frameworks and metrics, things like that are working in your area or jurisdiction, we would love to hear from you and perhaps have you at our workshop. We are really going to showcase to the extent possible things that are working in other jurisdictions. And with that, I am done with my slides.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you, Nadia. And I want to open it up now to comments and suggestions from the two of you and the full group. The department has asked me to ask you if you have recommendations regarding decision-making criteria, policies and programs that embed equity into the mix. So, and I'd ask you, I know this is a complex issue. You have the opportunity to make more detailed comments via email, but if you have short comments about how to embed equity into the department's work, we'd love to hear from you.
So I'll go ahead and kick it off, and then Nadia can can add to. But so in California, I think this work is just beginning. As I think Nadia actually referenced the CalEnviroScreen 3.0. That is a tool that many state agencies in California are using to start to identify communities that are impacted. So it considers many factors, including exposure to air pollutants, incidences of high mortality and cancer and other types of ailments, and then looks at socioeconomic factors as well. So it creates these kind of coarse polygons and mapping out the state of California. And we have there's some legislation that asks California to focus on areas with a certain score or higher. Typically it's like 75 or 80 is a threshold that has been used. So that's definitely one of the ways that we focus some of our incentive programs and efforts where we're trying to bring benefits to those communities. So one of the our research program in California, also called EPIC, has legislation where that requires 20% of all the technology demonstration and deployment projects to be located in disadvantaged communities. So for evaluation, they use a screening process where, say, for example, there's no new criteria pollutants from the baseline created by that demonstration project. One of the areas where we're seeing this play out is dairy digesters. So community, sorry, I'm gonna take a drink of water. Okay, so dairy digesters, community-based organizations have expressed concern about putting these large-scale projects in their communities. They're typically in rural communities where we have large dairy operations, and Central Valley is for California is one of those areas, and many of the communities there are disadvantaged communities by definition. So That is just one example of how we're applying equity and trying to make sure benefits reach the disadvantaged communities. As far as the SB 100 report, I would say that process is just kicking off. Again, we're looking for frameworks and practice about how metrics and common metrics and non-energy benefits can be integrated into our modeling processes. So right now we use capacity expansion and production cost modeling and tools, and that's what we're going to be exploring in the fall.
Thanks, Alicia. And I believe we have several questions and comments of people that have their hands raised. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Philip.
Okay, in the order I saw, Annette Smith, I think your hand was raised first. You can, oh, you're all set, ready to go.
Hello, this is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I appreciate the presentations, and also I've been following the Climate Council's discussions regarding equity. And I don't find that they address what I see as the justice and equity issues on the ground in Vermont. And this goes to siting, and it goes to the regulatory process, which nobody's talking about in terms of how we can address the tremendous inequity that takes place when a project, and it could be a gas pipeline, I've seen it, doesn't matter that it's renewable energy, but those who have an interest, and I will note that almost everyone in this forum has an economic interest in some way or another in building out renewables in Vermont. And I'm a somewhat unique voice in this realm. And when I see 75 people and I'm the only one speaking about this, I think that's an inequity in itself. Who is speaking for the people on the ground who are facing, let's say, an industrial wind project or an industrial solar project? And what does it mean to them and their lives? And when are we going to talk about the process of siting renewable energy in Vermont in a way that is fair? Because right now, if something comes to your neighborhood and there are issues, and there are real issues, it's not that all renewable is good everywhere. The first thing that the people have to do is raise a ton of money and hire a lawyer, or they have to try and figure out how to participate in the Public Utility Commission process, which everyone that I have assisted has come back saying it's brutal. It's a brutal process for the average citizen. The PUC has held workshops where they have invited people who have participated pro se, and they've asked me to get people to participate. And to a person, no one will do it. They say, I don't want to go back there. It was brutal. I don't want to revisit it.
Thanks,
That's
Annette.
a huge
So we get
issue.
that
I'll be quiet in a minute, Cindy. As I say, I'm the only one speaking from this perspective. And the other comment I want to make is that as we look at how to interact on this topic of siting renewables, I am observing a somewhat holier than thou attitude coming from developers who have this feeling that they are in the right, and anyone who raises questions or who even thinks there's an issue or this isn't a good site gets ridiculed, mocked, and that too is an equity issue that we need to start talking about, how to respect people and appreciate that just because it's renewable energy doesn't mean that it's necessarily being put in the right place. And my final comment is that I sent a presentation to Ed this morning that I did in 2019 about how to site renewable energy in a different way than how we're doing it. And thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thanks, Annette. Are there other commenters, Philip?
Yes, the next hand I saw was, and there's some a couple questions for Nadia and Alicia in the chat box, but let me go next to Ben Edgerly-Walsh.
Thanks. First, just really briefly wanted to lift up some of the comments that were in the chat that weren't really questions, just pointing out that historically we've dealt with siting in Vermont by not siting in Vermont and just letting all the burden fall on people elsewhere. So I'm glad we're starting to deal with that, and definitely think we need to do a lot more. My question, the reason I raised my hand is for Alicia or Nadia. In Vermont, and I'm sure this is true many other places, I don't have the stats other places, but in Vermont, Black Vermonters, BIPOC Vermonters, more generally low-income Vermonters are dramatically less likely to own their own home. Nadia, this is something that you definitely raised. I think you touched on it as well, Alicia. The fact that so many of our renewable energy programs that allow people to participate are really about literally owning or siting on your own property renewables. So any thoughts you have on how to get to the other side of that issue and make this transition to renewable energy, which has a whole host of benefits to the individuals who are able to themselves participate in it, accrue to all Vermonters and not just Vermonters who own their own home. So any thoughts on that would be very much appreciated. We're trying to figure out how to sort of reboot community energy in Vermont, which is something that we had for a little while, and it's more or less gone away, and there just aren't that many good options for people in that situation.
So Alicia or Nadia, do you have a response to that?
I can respond. I was going to let Nadia have a chance at responding first on this one.
Oh, thank you, Alicia. I think at a high level, what I was trying to emphasize in our presentation is, again, meeting Vermonters where they are. And a lot of that really means not only understanding what your target communities are, the housing circumstances in which they live, or the transportation issues in which they encounter on a daily basis, but also really building out data that allows you to analyze what the needs are. And so at the end of the day, if you're looking at equity and you have data that tells you that a majority of members of the BIPOC, disadvantaged, or low-income communities are not owning their homes, that's a great opportunity to really design or adapt the policy to actually meet that need by targeting developers or homeowners instead, or providing really robust incentives for individuals to engage in these programs on behalf of renters or individuals who live in mobile home parks.
And I will just echo that. In California, we also face the same kind of split incentive issue where for renters in particular, they're, it's not feasible, or they don't have control over the property to make these choices. And then the landlords don't have incentive either if it's going to cost more, and the benefactor will be the tenant. So I think there are programs that are available now in California that are really starting to target that incentive issue between tenant and landlord. I just don't have a lot of information on them, but it is an issue, I think, nationally, and I'll see if I can get some information on what we're doing in California. But I know on the energy efficiency side, we have some programs that are kind of emerging, and that's been an issue that they've been trying to tackle.
Thanks, Alicia and Nadia. And we have about 5 more minutes, and we do want to have a 10-minute break for people to get food, a bio break, that kind of thing. So, but want to continue this discussion a little bit longer. Philip, are there other people that have their hands raised?
Yes, let me ask 2 questions from the chat before I get
Right.
to John Woodward, who's raised his hand. So the first question is for Alicia, and this is from your presentation, wondering why there isn't much of an increase until 2030, and why, so in other words, why it doesn't ramp up sooner.
So I think this is mostly because of the long lead times, and but I probably have to get back on this question as well. So let me see if I'm going to see if I can get the answer to that question before we start. Is there another question maybe I can respond to in the meantime?
Yes, thank you for the excellent presentation on SB 100 and how California is planning to create a clean energy supply. Could you please also touch on the topic of demand? In other words, how is energy efficiency and active demand management being considered as a resource towards meeting the SB 100 goals?
Okay, so similar to Vermont, we treat energy efficiency as the top priority. So we started modeling our SB 100 scenarios using these demand scenarios that were developed looking out to the 2050 decarbonization goals for the state. So a lot of that demand side and energy efficiency was baked in from the start. But we are looking at the next round of modeling, just really looking at higher load flexibility and demand side management to help reduce the number of resources that the renewable resources that need to be built out. So I think that's also an emerging discussion and one that we want to explore further in the next round of SB 100 modeling. We're also doing load management standards in California, and so that's an active proceeding going on right now, but really trying to reduce the utility scale renewables that we need to build out in the state by having smarter management of our demand side resources. And that's we believe that's a huge potential in the state, and as it probably is in a lot of places. But as we start to deploy more light duty electric vehicles, as people get behind the meter solar and storage, we're really trying to enable the management of those resources so that there's less draw on the grid, and that they can even provide power back to the grid in times of need. So right now in California, we've had a few flex alerts this year, 6 to be exact, where we're asking customers to reduce their usage to help with grid reliability. So lots of things in play, but demand side management and efficient appliances are definitely front and center and priority for our state.
Thanks, Alicia. And we need to wrap up to give people a little bit of a break. Are there any other comments or questions, Philip, before we do that?
I think the person with the hand up longest is John Woodward. So if you have a brief question, John.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. Thanks. Thanks for this discussion. So two things that are coming to my mind listening to all this. One is really a curiosity about what we can learn from some of the other states, namely California's experience with their intervenor support programs that they have. They actually allocate specific monies to provide for people who don't have financial resources, or even like, the technical procedural knowledge that it takes to navigate a docket or a proceeding of any kind. Maybe even there's something to learn from the discourse that's going on right now around FERC and the Office of Public Participation that they're finally standing up. So interested in, Nadia and Alicia's experience and knowledge of those things. Other thing is, maybe I missed it, but it just seems like it really needs to be said in any conversation about equity. And it's the question of rate design and recovering fixed costs, and the large question mark around how do we avoid shifting more and more of the fixed costs of the system onto the folks least able to pay more for the service that they get. I mean, that's an enormous question that people are grappling with, but it seems to be very much close to the center of this. It's not the only thing. Partially, it's an artifact of our reliance on variable charges for cost recovery. Some would argue over-reliance. It's definitely compounded by net metering and self-generation policies. It's not necessarily the root cause, but I just think that conversation really needs to be highlighted. Maybe even starting with sort of a clear picture of how we currently do rate design, sort of the classic 3-part tariff, how that does in fact allocate the cost of service across different socioeconomic groups instead of just, rate classes, commercial, industrial, residential. I'll shut up now, but those are my comments.
Thank you, John. And those are two huge topics, very important, obviously. We don't have time for those in this forum. I'm wondering if you could have that conversation with Nadia and Alicia and the department offline, because they're obviously very important considerations. Would that work for you to make connections with them?
Totally. And just using the microphone a little bit here too. So.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, John. And Philip, who else do we have on tap here?
Steve Crowley has raised his hand.
Go for it, Steve.
Hi, thanks. Appreciate the presentations very much. So I'll be brief. I just have an observation, and I think one of the themes that I've heard come up a number of times here is that of ownership or lack thereof. The fact that I think we all recognize in the larger picture that ownership of homes and other important pieces of our lives have been it's one of the challenging issues for groups of our population for historical reasons, and it's been going on sometimes intentionally for many years, and it relates to home ownership or apartment ownership, condo ownership, or ownership of our energy production. And I think that to me, this seems like one of those areas where the equity challenge cries out for rethinking our approach to that. And part of that might be things like community solar that are really owned by the people who use them. Then there's a lot beyond that. But I think that's one of the key themes that if we really want to address the question of equity in our society at large, we have to rethink that whole ownership question. That's all.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Are there comments or questions before we take a brief break? Anybody on the phone? Okay, so
I do have a quick response to the question about why we're not looking beyond, or why the build out doesn't start until 2030. So it actually starts in 2027, and then we have other efforts that are focused on the near term years. So SB 100 was a longer term planning horizon, and so we made a conscious decision to start around 2027 for the portfolios.
Thanks, Alicia. Okay, so we're going to take a much shorter break than we'd intended and reconvene at 12:05. Do I have that right, department folks? Does that work?
Yeah, Cindy, that sounds great. And thanks for folks bearing with us. We've done a lot of context setting this morning. I think we'll get much more into the discussion. I just want to thank Alicia and Nadia once more as we head out for teeing up this great conversation for us. We're very appreciative of your time.
Yes, thank you. And we'll reconvene in a few minutes. Hopefully you can get some food again soon. Are we back?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
I think we're waiting on Claire and the PSD team.
Can you hear me, Philip?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, maybe if we just take an extra minute or so and allow Ed to get back, and then we'll get restarted.
Sounds good. And
Thank
then
you.
Ed will introduce Liz.
Yep, exactly.
Excellent.
Cindy, could you remind me how much time is allocated on the agenda for presentation versus comment, just so I have it in mind when we try to stay to it?
And Cindy, Liz, this is Claire. We have you up to 15 minutes.
Great, thanks, Claire.
Yep. Right. Good.
Great, thanks very much. At this point, we're going to turn it over to Liz Miller. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, before we get to you, Liz, just really quick. Just want to reiterate the objectives for today. What we really want to do is start thinking about how do you design a renewable energy standard going forward? What are some of the trade-offs? What decision-making criteria should be identified or should be used? How you employ different criteria and what different strategies, policies, and programs are out there, and what are some recommendations about how we think about these. So thanks for that, Liz, and I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, and I'll do my best to keep at or under my time limit here so we can get to the real meat, which are the comments of the folks who've attended. I feel like the context slide that we put together largely can be skipped, maybe other than the last portion here on the regional generation fleet. Just in light of the conversation this morning regarding other states and some of the comments I've seen in chat, it is important as we think about what Vermont's renewable energy policy and carbon reduction policies will be going forward to consider the regional fleet. There is a significant amount of renewable resources in the queue, as they say, looking to be built in the next several years. It's primarily from a resource mix, offshore wind, and also some solar large scale, as well as a few other resources. But those resources need to be delivered, actually built and start generating in order to help the region as a whole decarbonize, because eventually that will greatly change the mix of the system here in New England, but it needs to happen in order for that to occur. And of course, that also means that there will be infrastructure costs necessary to connect those resources. That's paid for on a regional basis for some projects and on a project basis for others. And so that's something we're going to have to take into account, along with the electricity market structures that wrap around that. I know Massachusetts, when they speak later, will speak a little bit about that issue. And also the timing. There's been a point made a few times that, you know, on a day in the winter time at 6 p.m., if you look at the mix, it's not at all renewable as we on an annual basis count our mix here. So really making sure that we have resources that can deliver when Vermonters need it, especially as we move over time to measuring on a more real-time basis will be incredibly important, as well as looking at how the system as a whole operates in order to deliver that reliably and affordably for customers. Okay, so as I would call it, I think it's probably best to call it a straw proposal. I think that's probably the best way to frame it. In order to really stimulate discussion on the choices, Ed and I and some others on the cross-sector mitigation committee have been talking about what would it look like if Vermont were to move its current renewable energy standard, which as Ed described, moves to 75% by 2032 under a variety of criteria, to 100% standard as a way to help ensure deeper decarbonization. And there's many things that have to be determined if you're going to move that way. Among them, the cost, of course, because it depends upon the design as well as the system improvements that would be required to support it. There's also, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that the Data and Science Subcommittee, as Ed described earlier, are looking to characterize in terms of what resources would be used, as well as siting issues that have been primarily looked at by a different subcommittee, but certainly have been raised here. And I know the Comprehensive Energy Plan looks at those as well. So shifting to 100% policy would be intended to ensure deeper decarbonization as electrification in particular happens. Our usage grows over time, and the mix of electricity used to supply it, if it becomes even cleaner over time, would ensure that the electrification leads decarbonization. Meanwhile, other states increasing their own renewable requirements and decarbonization requirements will help the region as a whole move toward 100% and eventually decarbonize. Next slide. So I just wanted to tee up quickly. I am not gonna talk in detail about this because we really want to hear from you. What we think are the kind of key policy issues or choices or trade-offs, whatever way you want to frame it, that one would have to take into account if we are going to amend and improve the renewable energy standard that currently exists in Vermont. So of course, how much should be in-state, built here, new? How much resource from outside of the state, new or existing, should be utilized? How will existing resources in Vermont be treated in terms of vintage? That's listed later as well. You know, we've talked about the renewable energy credit system that backs up the actual attribute here in the region. And Ed went over some of the build that's happened here in Vermont that at this time doesn't actually account toward the renewable energy standard. Should that change? And if so, how? That covers both new and existing in terms of what the line should be. Measurement period, as I mentioned before, right now, we, like other states, measure on an annual basis and ensure that we meet the percentage requirements annually, even though daily and seasonally, the mix can look quite different. And changing that over time, or at least putting a design in place that would allow for change over time, will also help deeper decarbonization. And it will help take into account the need to meet wintertime load, for example, if indeed electrification drives that even higher, as the ISO slides we saw earlier projected. How to be mindful of cost in doing all of that, of course, is incredibly important, especially if one is aiming to decarbonize by fuel switching, including moving to electricity from fossil fuels. Those need to be affordable and cost competitive for the customers who will actually be the ones who need to make the changes in their lives to make it happen. And different costs are presented by different designs. It's just something that needs to be analyzed. And then finally, and I'm sure there are others that all of you will raise, the final trade-off we thought we should put on the table is looking at renewable as the standard, as Vermont currently does, or instead carbon-free, or perhaps one building upon the other, carbon-free going to renewable. How should we be looking at that? What definitions should we be using? And while science and data is the subcommittee is looking specifically at the GHG inventory and the resources, there's this larger question that's presented of how the Vermont Renewable Energy Standard is defined as using renewable resources rather than strictly carbon-free, and what trade-offs result from that. So that's really it. We can go to the next one, which just talks more about the timing needs. I feel like Ed hit this pretty well, so I'd like to give more time for comments if possible. But basically, even using the ISO New England slides, which, as I think James pointed out, don't even attempt to model, quote, getting there on what we really need to deeply decarbonize. And, having this meeting the day after the IPCC new report came out makes it a pretty stark reminder of the challenge. But having more load in the wintertime in particular will just mean that we need to make sure our resources match the usage. And you can also look at it in terms of needing to make sure the system is able to deliver reliably and affordably and adequately, all the kind of typical standards we look at all the time, because Vermonters, if they electrify, will be relying more and more on the electric system. It's not just a matter of inconvenience to not have the lights on. It could be in the future, will be in the future for many more people, a matter of ensuring transportation, ensuring heating, critical life functions that need to be supported by a system that delivers all the time. I think the last slides are duplicative of just showing the load issues, so we don't need to probably hit those, Claire. And I think with that, if people don't mind the very quick run through to try to get us back on track, I can use the extra 7 minutes for comments, if that's okay with folks.
Thank you very much, Liz. And yeah, so here's the plan. Patrick Woodcock can't join us until 1. So we're going to have a discussion, questions for Liz and general discussion. And then at 1, we'll shift to Patrick Woodcock, who's the Commissioner of Energy Resources in Massachusetts, and then we'll continue the discussion. So if people have short comments or questions, that'd be great. Please, it's a huge topic. You have an opportunity to make longer comments by email and snail mail, but if you have things that you think would be helpful to raise in this forum, please do so. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Patrick, to see whose hands are raised.
This is Philip. I think you mean me.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sure. So there are comments, a number of comments in the chat. Let me go to the raised hands, starting with George Gross. You can unmute yourself. Oh,
you
George.
need to unmute yourself, George.
There we go. So I think one of the things that's not been addressed in the conversation so far sufficiently is our relationship with the ISO New England grid and its planning procedures. As you're no doubt aware, their long-term plan is fairly extensive. They have several committees at any given time studying how to direct their respective markets, forward capacity market in particular. It's pretty obvious that all the states independently are creating their own version of a renewable energy standard. There's not a lot of coordination at this point. That needs to be, I think, addressed. And also, ISO New England needs to be engaged by Vermont on a much more active level so that everybody comes to a consensus about how to retire this gas-fired power plant fleet that we have that's currently providing a majority of the power in New England, other than the imported power and nuclear. So until we get that elephant in the room kind of taken care of, this discussion about how to fix it in Vermont is kind of a sideshow, frankly, because the scale of our electrons are still coming from fossil fuels. And that's one of the issues that I think we've been skirting for many years now. It's easy to purchase contracts with other entities that make our emissions look green and zero emissions, but frankly, that is not adding additionality. It's simply pushing the problem off to somewhere else. So I think I like to see that to be the center of the conversation from here out. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
So Cindy, if I can just interrupt really quick. George, that's a great point and appreciate that. I will say the states all meet on a regular basis and work with ISO New England. ISO New England right now is looking at, as a part of in response to a request by all the states, ISO New England is looking at a transmission build out and a resource build out, assuming 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind, 8,000 megawatts of solar, distributed solar, and also meeting all of the electrification needs. So we're starting that process. We've actually been working on it for a while. It's a pretty complex model though, looking at lots of different generation, transmission, and other things, but you're completely right. We need to work well within the region as a whole and better coordination. We can always do a better job coordinating, but there's not a dearth of coordination at the moment, but we can definitely do better. So I just wanted to respond to that quickly. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed.
Sure.
So Philip, are there other
Follow-up
comments
observation.
or questions?
I did have a follow-up observation, what I just talked about.
Hang on, George.
With
George, let's give other people a chance to comment and question, and you and Ed can have a more in-depth conversation offline. Okay, thank you. So Philip?
And Annette Smith raised her hand next.
Okay.
Go ahead,
So
Annette.
do you have
Thank you. This is
short
Annette
question,
Smith
Annette?
with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I think we need a paradigm shift in how we are approaching the development of renewable energy. I think that we have done it all completely backwards and upside down. We've let the developers lead choosing sites. We've let the utilities lead in some respects choosing sites. And I think we need to start from the community perspective and look at how to serve local load. Look at how to build next to load and do it in a way that is part of looking at the grid, so that development goes in places that support the grid, that doesn't go in places that are overtaxed. And that I think that's the way to build community support for what we're talking about. I mean, when I just posted the numbers of what's right now in the regional mix and in Vermont, I mean, right now there's 16,000 megawatts in the region, but Vermont's using 600 megawatts. This has been way too hard and way too complicated. I live off grid with solar and batteries and a gasoline generator. And I'm sorry, I cannot figure out how to get off that gasoline generator or propane in the winter when the solar hot water isn't working. And I have said before to some of these subcommittees of the Climate Council, I really think it's a mistake to put all the eggs in the electricity basket, that we do have some other technologies that can directly get us off fossil fuels, and that is solar hot water, which apparently has a much faster payback than photovoltaics. I think we do need to look at other possible technologies, as some people are posting in the chat. But I think that we have a potential for microgrids, and I think that if we look at Vermont's needs specifically in specific communities, maybe we could do a case study. I've had companies reach out to me about how can we do a microgrid, and the utilities have to be a part of it. And instead, what we're seeing is all these resources being built that are actually selling the RECs out of state that don't even count towards the state's goals. And people get really upset about that. And my other comment is that, and I'm not sure if this is the right place or if it's another section of this meeting, but I would like to see us take industrial wind off the table in Vermont. It's not an appropriate technology. And I think this is the time and the place to have that discussion and note that it does environmental damage, it does social damage, and it is simply not an appropriate technology for Vermont. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. Philip, other comments or questions?
Chase has the next hand up.
Chase, if you can unmute.
Thank you. It's just unmuting there. Chase Whiting with Conservation Law Foundation. I'm an attorney on the Clean Energy and Climate Change team. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I appreciate it. And I appreciate too the honest, sincere conversation around a 100% renewable energy standard, especially as building on a few ideas that have been put out there around concepts of as clean a renewable energy standard as possible, looking at low or as close to no greenhouse gas emission sources of energy as possible, and also looking at bringing new such sources online, speaking to the topic of additionality. The comment that I want to raise now pertains to the topic of a potential 100% renewable energy standard. And the comment arises in relation to a parallel conversation that's going on in the Public Utility Commission right now, where in docket number 21-1107-PET, Global Foundries, a large microchip processor and significant employer here in Vermont, has filed a petition requesting to become a self-managed utility, is what it's calling itself, that would source its own electricity through the ISO New England system. And as part of that petition, it's requesting that it would be exempt from the renewable energy standard entirely, which would mean that all the electricity sources could come through the ISO system, potentially could be from the general mix, which as we know contains lots of fossil fuel in the form of natural gas, especially. This seems significant since Global Foundries is approximately 8% of Vermont's total electricity load. And so noting the size of Global Foundries electricity load and the fact that they've requested to be exempt from the new renewable energy standard, and also noting that there's been general support indicated from both Green Mountain Power and from the Department of Public Services, I'm curious, in the context of a 100% renewable energy standard, if Green Mountain Power and the state are currently considering a possibility in which 8% of Vermont's electricity load would not be subject to the renewable energy standard, how then are we basically accounting for that or addressing that when we do speak about implementation of a 100% renewable energy standard in Vermont? The two seem a little bit in conflict with one another. Thank you.
So, Ed, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, so I'm a witness in the case, and it's a litigation in front of the PUC, as Chase noted, and I don't really consider it appropriate for me to be basically continuing the litigation in a public forum when the parties aren't there. So I will say it's an issue, Chase, and it should be discussed in the context of that docket.
I'm happy just to add a couple points. Obviously, Green Mountain Power is in that docket as well. One of the reasons we supported the petition was because Global Foundries indicated in their petition to the PUC that they were committed to meeting the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. As Ed noted in his presentation, there are portions of Vermont statute that apply for greenhouse gas reduction goals that are different than the renewable energy standard, which is directed at retail electric providers, those of us with customers that fulfill portfolios for delivery to our customers. So at least on Green Mountain Power's part, as I think the testimony there showed, that's an important part of the petition for us to have Global Foundries held to what they said they would do, and something that I believe the commission will be looking at going forward.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to encourage you to have a deeper conversation offline if that's appropriate, given the litigation. Other questions or comments, Philip?
The next raised hand is from Sam Swanson.
I participate in these issues in a number of forums to bring that introduce different perspectives, serve on the Clean Energy Development Board, Local Energy Committee, and on the Board of Directors of Vermont Interfaith Power and Light, which looks at it very much from a consumer and value-based perspective. With that background, I'd like to emphasize the importance, I think, needs to be placed on the second item in your list of key policy issues, this new versus existing resources and the way we manage RECs to achieve our goals. I believe quite strongly that there's a role for existing resource buying RECs from the existing resources in order to keep the existing resources operating, and there's clearly a role for that. But I think over and over, what people find confusing and disconcerting is the notion that they see resources being purchased in Vermont, built in Vermont, and then arbitraged, sold off to other states and backfilled with resources that have been in place for decades. And that isn't consistent. It's not, and it's not all wrong and it's not all right. But what I think both the plan and the work of the Climate Commission really needs to do is to get this, lay out some guidelines that make sense and that pass the straight face test. It's one tries to explain to a consumer who has just made an investment in solar what's happened to their solar, and what that in fact they didn't really own solar. They really own a share of it's been Green Mountain Power has, or any of the other utilities has sold that the solar quality to a utility or someone else in another state, and it's been retired there and has been in its place has been something else has been purchased. It might be Hydro-Quebec, it might be an old hydro plant within Vermont or whatever. But I think I think this can be managed, and but it needs to be managed, because the credibility of everything that we're trying to achieve really hinges on that being sound and also understandable. That's my point.
Thank you, Sam. So that transparency piece is hugely important, obviously.
Cindy, can I ask Sam a question? Because
sure.
I'm interested in the comment. Sam, how would you treat then resources built in Vermont from Ed's chart said 2005, I think, to 2015, prior to the res? Would you actually consider moving the vintage year so that so that owners of those projects can count them toward the res? Is that, I'm just trying to understand specifically, if you have a suggestion, what you would do in the design to account for it. And if it's better to follow up separately, that's fine. I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, I actually think that this is, I could answer it, but I think the answer to the question should be process. I think that right now it's not there are two components of my comment. One was that there be a clear and orderly process like you're describing, that the guidelines for certain parts of the total resource that we're trying to acquire, that we need to require. You can easily think of criteria. For example, if we're expanding load, and with the purpose of backing out figure out how that is being done and what the consumer impact of it is in terms of what people's understanding of it is. And I think that the work of there's been so much work done nationally on this, and the standards have been established for doing this in a reasonable way. The one that you have offered is credible, but I think that that's something that a working group should really sort through in an orderly way. And I think you've got time and process, and I just urging that you place a priority on it, because I really think that it undermines the credibility. I'm in so many conversations where people, I explain what we're doing and I advocate for why it's appropriate, and they say, I don't get it. This is all BS. This is all just smoke and mirrors. As long as you're using RECs, they don't count. They're no value. They only confuse things. And you're undermining the credibility and validity of all of what we're trying to do. And it's so important. And I think the work of this, not only the people who are working on the plan, but the people who are working on the Climate Council are really working hard. And I think this has to be addressed, or you're going to find that it's not going to stand up.
Thanks, Sam. Other questions or comments?
Ken Nolan raised his hand next.
Ben, if you unmute yourself. Okay.
Thanks. Ken Nolan, Vermont Public Power Supply Authority. I have to start with, it's not often that Annette and I agree on items, being a utility person, but this is a case where I do agree that this conversation is often driven by developers who have a vested interest in making money and want a certain design that meets their business model. There's also a tendency for the state to want to command and control and drive decisions from the top down. And I just want to go back and advocate consumer cost needs to be at the top of the list when we're evaluating which policies to put in place. Anytime you start putting arbitrary restrictions on what can be done, we need to buy power from inside Vermont. We need to buy power less than 2 megawatts in size. We need to buy power that was only constructed in 2018 or later. Every time one of those restrictions is put in place, you increase the cost to consumers because you limit the market that they can go to. So I want to urge the Climate Council and then the department to really think about what are the key drivers that need to be put in place to implement the policies. Stay at that level and let the local communities decide how they want to actually meet those goals. Representing municipal utilities, I have conversations. I was just in Lyndonville last night having this very conversation where they've invested in hydro plants, have had those operating for over 100 years. And now they're wondering, with these changes in policy, are those plants going to go away and they're going to be forced to buy into solar power or something else to replace it? The local communities should have a say in how they meet these guidelines, and the policies from the state should stay at the highest level possible to allow this transition to occur. I think that's how you get the best solution for Vermont, and don't be overly restrictive in what you're going to allow.
Thanks, Ken. Philip, other people with their hands raised?
I see 2 more raised hands. Next is Ben Walsh.
Thanks again. Hope folks can hear me. I have a little bit of background noise here. Oh, wait. Good timing. So a few quick questions. One, I don't think I've heard the word additionality raised yet here, although people have been sort of dancing around that in different ways. Everyone here knows DPERG strongly believes that we need to be building a lot of new renewables and dramatically more than we are actually requiring under our current policies. But I want to also speak to the question of vintage that you raised, Liz, in relation to your conversation with Sam. In my mind, the core thing that we need to be driving is additionality. Are we actually getting more renewables built because of policies that we have? If we're not, then we're not reducing global greenhouse gas pollution, which is what we absolutely need to do, as we all know, because the world's on fire. So that makes it about new renewables significantly, but in terms of the vintage year, a construct like had been proposed in the 2012 Renewable Energy Standard Bill, which ended up just being a standard offer bill because the RES was jettisoned at the last minute. That one basically put the start date back to the beginning of SPEED and said, all of these standard offer projects, all of these SPEED projects that we've built here in Vermont should be able to count. And frankly, that would create additionality because those RECs would not be retired out of state, and other parts of New England would then be forced to go and find or build other renewable electricity themselves, which would create more renewable energy while solving the problem that Sam raised. So that I wanted to make sure was set on the record. The other thing that I wanted to raise is just a strong second to what Chase raised around global foundries. And due respect to Ed, I do have enormous respect for you. However, you stated that this should be discussed in the context of that proceeding at the PUC. This is a policy discussion. And of course it is being discussed in that context, but it has to be discussed in the policy context as well. If we had Green Mountain Power coming forward and saying, we'd like everyone else to get to 100% renewable electricity, but in our territory, we're only going to get to 90%. that would be considered a policy discussion. And that is functionally what is happening here with Global Foundries trying to get out of any requirements, whatever flowery language they have around what they would like to do. They are saying we should not be required to do anything in terms of renewable electricity. If they're serious about that commitment, they should bind themselves to the same requirements that every other electricity user in the state has, and be part of the renewable energy standard going forward. So if that can't be disentangled, then the department shouldn't be leading that corner, that 8% of the electricity part of this conversation at the Climate Council and in the Comprehensive Energy Plan. That just is a core piece. They're the largest energy user in the state of Vermont, and we can't have that be like a side issue. Thanks for taking the time.
And Jared Duvall has raised his hand.
Great, thanks.
Ben, is it okay? Did you have a question that needed to be answered?
If anyone wants to respond to any of that, no, but I wanted to get those two things, probably one of them slightly better received than the other.
Thanks, Ben.
So Ben, I do want to just acknowledge what you're saying. My concern is more the legal issues. Completely understand what you're saying about the policy. I just have concerns about competing counsel questioning of witness outside of the litigation. I agree that Global Foundries should be discussed at some point, though. Completely hear what you're saying there. It's the mechanism that is bothering me more than the content.
I totally respect that, and I will step back and let other people speak, but fully respect that you are in a hard position right here in being asked questions about this in this context and certain by other parties. But it does seem like that needs to be addressed, and not just by sort of not worrying about it, which it feels like is sort of the status quo right now.
So thanks, Ben. I think you have an agreement there that this isn't the forum for continued conversation on this particular point at this moment. And I'm going to turn it over to Jared. Or, do I have your right name right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cindy. So I just want to start by saying that what I'm about to share, I want to make clear is being shared in my role as an appointee to the Vermont Climate Council, and not in my role with EAN because of the responsibility that we have to serve as a neutral convener for a very broad and diverse network that has different opinions on these questions. So I'm just speaking in my role as a counselor. But I want to speak to the question too in terms of the criteria and get on the table some of the criteria that I'm thinking about when it comes to meeting the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements as we work towards a climate action plan. And for me, so much of this is not exclusive, but so much of it comes down to cost-effective and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And so I want to say a little bit more about each of those. On the first criteria, in terms of cost-effective, I think we need to look for the largest and fastest greenhouse gas emissions reduction possible per dollar invested. And I want to say that I think that needs to be regardless of sector. I think oftentimes we use the electricity and energy sectors interchangeably. I think that there are many times when there are cost-effective emissions reduction strategies that are not going to show up with regard to electricity generation, that have to do with weatherization or fuel switching in transportation and thermal sectors. And I'm not in a position where I want to pick technology winners or prefer specific approaches over another. I think they need to be on a level playing field, and that we need to think not just of the cost effectiveness of different tiers of the res or different res design options, but also in the context of other GHG emissions reduction strategies that can exist either outside of or alongside the renewable energy standard. The other piece that I would highlight is the importance of energy cost reductions for Vermonters, especially lower income Vermonters and those facing high energy burdens. And again, That to me is regardless of energy sector. So if there are, and I recognize that this gets complicated because tier 3 works across, is embedded within the res and speaks to fossil fuel reductions outside of just directly the electricity sector. But there are other important criteria, but I really just want to share that from my vantage point, serving on the council, those are two of the criteria that are most top of mind for me from a total energy and total emissions framework, not just an electricity sector framework, and that is cost-effective and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared. And to follow up on that, the department has asked me to ask you as a group regarding recommendations for equitable renewable energy standards. Any comments that you all have as to how the department can be equitable as it develops those standards would be appreciated. So I want to open it up to the floor. So I believe people are raising their hands. Philip, can you monitor that?
Yes. So I don't know if they might have pre-existing questions, not particularly about that question. But Chase has already spoken, so we'll come back to Chase. James Moore, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. 2 quick points. The first on that equitable question regarding the renewable energy standard. And I would ask that Jared, you and all of the other counselors expand the view of equitable beyond Vermonters, because the idea that it's somehow equitable to push costs onto other communities, health impacts onto other communities, and carbon pollution onto other communities so that Vermonters' rates can be lower, I don't think that to me doesn't fit any reasonable definition of equitable. And in terms of costs, I would encourage all the folks involved in the Global Warming Solutions Act. There have been lots of numbers historically thrown around regarding the cost effectiveness of different measures and the cost effectiveness of weatherization compared to, or of XYZ compared to. The challenge is that we actually don't know the cost of success in those sectors. What we currently know is the cost of failure in those sectors, because we've never actually met the goals. So it could cost 3 times more if we actually wanted to meet the goals. We've never actually put policies in place that successfully weatherize the homes and successfully reduce the carbon emissions. So when we consider how quote unquote cost effective something is relative to a sector like electricity, where we've seen tremendous actual success, I think we absolutely should find out what is the cost of success in those other sectors. Fully supportive of that. Where I think we have gone off the rails is that we come at this from all too often a perspective of constraint, and we can't do this sector because we should be doing that sector, when the reality of the climate report and the current sciences, we have to do all of these, probably at radically different levels than we're contemplating now. So the idea that we're going to do less in one so that we can theoretically do more in another, I think, leaves us with a broken climate.
Thanks, James. And so we have about 10 more minutes before Patrick Woodcock of the Commissioner of Energy Resources for Massachusetts joins us. So we'll continue the discussion till then. He'll do a presentation and then we'll continue the discussion after that. So just wanted to set the stage for you. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Philip, in terms of people with their hands raised.
Okay, Chase and George, I do see you, but I'm going to actually go to Bill Bender next because I don't think he's spoken yet.
Yes, thanks very much. And I very much echo what James just said, having spent more than a decade of my life having worked in some of the poorest countries in the world. If we really want to think about equity in greenhouse gas emissions, it's impacting people largely outside of the United States the worst. So we do need a broad brush thinking about that. And also in response to Ken Nolan's point, I mean, we have to, natural gas is still probably the cheapest way to get energy. Unfortunately, the externalities of burning natural gas, which is destroying the planet, are not costed. So it is going to be more expensive to actually solve the problem. And Vermont has largely been pushing that off to other people rather than solving the problem ourselves. But I think it's super important to think about what happens. Anything we do today is dramatically more useful than something we do in 5 years or 10 years. And the thing that we can do today that is by far the most cost-effective is more distributed solar, and combining that with EVs, which automatically bring battery capacity onto the grid, that largely gets rid of the duck curve issue when those two things are put together. But as we heard from the UN Secretary General, it's a code red for humanity. So speed is of the essence here. We have to do the lowest hanging fruit. We have to do things that we can do today. One really simple thing is, Vermonters actually want solar. They want batteries. And our customers, they electrify transportation 10 times faster than the average Vermonter. They put in batteries 10 times faster. They put in heat pumps 10 times faster. So, and if you if you electrify your house, you have a whole lot of expenses within a household. When you do that with solar, some of that's accessible for the ITC. But a really important example of and we also have to distinguish between fiscal costs for the state, which is going to be really problematic, and costs with private investment, which is a big difference in the speed of adoption. When Vermonters want to invest in their own residential solar, starting on September 1, and I'm saying this as a PhD in economics, there's the 34% tax on residential solar. So the way to think of that is, if you have a garden in your backyard and you grow homegrown tomatoes, and you grow 3 bushels of tomatoes in your backyard, the state of Vermont is coming up to your door and saying, we are going to take 1 bushel of those tomatoes away. Or if you prefer, we will happily change 3 bushels of chemically grown tomatoes from Mexico that were picked a month ago, and we will swap your 3 bushels of fresh homegrown organic tomatoes with these 3 bushels, or actually with these 2.7 bushels of tomatoes from Mexico that are chemically grown and a month old, and we'll only take a 10% tax if you're willing to swap. That's what the solar policy in Vermont is. There's a 34%
Do you have a
tax.
recommendation or a comment?
Yes, it's simple. You get rid of the production meter in residential solar in Vermont. There's no production meter in New Hampshire. The only way that the PUC can assess these charges on self-consumed solar in Vermont is on the basis of the production meter. That should be eliminated. If you have a garden, you're not taxed on it. If you cut wood in your backyard, you're not taxed on it.
Got it.
If you produce solar and consume it in your own home, in your EV, in a battery, in your water heater, you should not be taxed on it. The policy should be at the meter where you interface with the grid.
Thanks, Bill. So I think we have time for one more brief comment before the Commissioner of Energy Resources from Massachusetts joins us. Philip?
And Jeff Forward has his hand up.
Hello, thank you for taking my comment. My comment's relative to least cost planning. I think as we think about least cost planning, we must include jobs, public health, and equity. And we need to quantify that in dollar terms so that it can be compared with supply side solutions that utilities must meet. We did this with demand side management back in the 90s. I think we can do it now. And I think it needs to be a quantifiable dollars and cents metric that's included with least cost planning. And I would agree with a lot of the comments that have been recently made. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. So I don't know, do we have Patrick online yet, or is he, are we still waiting for him? Does somebody help me?
This is Philip. I do not see him. It's possible he called in, but I don't see him listed as a attendee.
Okay, so let's go with another comment or question.
Okay, George, you're up next.
Be brief. So I've done some planning exercises where I tried to do what amounted to a budget estimate of the capital investment that Vermont would need to do for its energy mix across different sectors, thermal and transportation and electric. And I think it should come as no surprise that what we're really looking at is hundreds of millions of dollars of investment over the next decade. And there's been relatively little discussion about how to raise the monies for that in this conversation. And the res would probably have a big part in that in terms of influencing where we direct that money to go so that it gets the best bang for your buck. And the social equity issue also interacts with that because the ability to pay back the debt that's incurred building out that infrastructure is hardest for those of lesser means unless we redesign how we recover those costs. And right now, there's no conversation about a carbon tax. We talked about the societal costs of carbon emissions, but there's this big disconnect I see between the actual budgetary goals we would have in front of us to get this job done versus the willingness to step up to funding it and developing a plan for how to have it paid for equitably so that it's accessible for everybody and shared equally by everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, George. So let's fit in another comment or two. Do we have more hands raised, Philip?
I don't see any more hands. I do have a chat question, if I remember, from Bill Bender a few minutes ago. He was noting that Hydro-Quebec has a large amount of energy storage, effectively stored in their reservoirs. And he asked if Vermont or any other states or utilities have examined how to use Hydro-Quebec as more of a balancing resource to enable renewables. So maybe Ed McNamara can comment on whether this has been pursued or discussed.
Yeah, good question. So that there has been some discussion I mentioned earlier in response to George's question or George's statement about ISO New England. In looking at 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind, there's going to be times when you'd have to essentially spill. You'd be producing more than the region could actually use. And so the idea that's being bounced around a little bit is essentially it would potentially require additional lines from New England to Hydro-Quebec, but during times when there's excess renewable production in New England, that it would be essentially shipped up to Hydro-Quebec, or at least Hydro-Quebec would not be delivering into New England during those times. And so there is the basic concept that Hydro-Quebec their storage could act as a really large scale battery over longer duration. Still an issue that's being explored, but it's a good question though. Thanks.
I can just add quickly, it's Liz, not so much on the Hydro-Quebec contract that presently exists, which is in place, through mid-2030s, but when we have looked at large hydro lately, we have looked at it to determine how we could better use it as a balancing resource. And it was the primary motivator behind a recent contract Green Mountain Power entered into and was recently reviewed by the PUC with Great River Hydro, which has some resources that have the ability to deliver on a shape that more closely fits the seasonal profile that we have. So I can say that you're on the right track there. In general, that is the way that these types of resources should be looked at when they can be, in order to maximize. I mean, really the way we thought of that contract, Great River, is it enabled us to pursue more local generation here in Vermont that's not hydro, because if you think about it, you know, as more solar comes on, if you can balance it with something else, and that's all good. So short version is yes, it needs to be looked at more closely, and we have looked at that with regard to other large hydro resources.
Thanks, Liz. And I see that Patrick Woodcock has just joined us. So Ed, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce Patrick.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Patrick, for joining us. So Patrick is Commissioner at Department of Energy Resources. I've worked with him for years in multiple contexts before Massachusetts. Patrick was also worked at the Maine Energy Governor's Office, I believe. I've definitely worked quite a bit with Patrick in Maine. And I've asked Patrick to go through some different clean electricity policies, what Massachusetts is doing. Really want to get a sense of what other folks are doing, and Mass is doing some fantastic programs in the region that I think should be looking to, and how they could fit in well with Vermont. So Patrick, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation, Ed, and always happy to share a different state's perspective. I don't think any of us can, we're all laboratories here and learning from each other, so appreciate the invitation. I'll put in the context that I think we have continued to learn how to use our attribute markets to maximize the benefits of what is an evolving state goal from an emission standpoint, and from what we really see as an increasing ambition of the amount of clean electricity that's really required. If you go to the next slide, if anybody has not seen this, this is a really guiding principle that will inform Massachusetts in the years to come, but issued in the end of last year, a decarbonization roadmap looked at all of the options across the economy of what would ultimately lead to the least cost net zero goal in 2050. If you go to the next slide, I think what is really highlighted from that report is increasingly we're more confident that electrification will be a primary pathway to deep decarbonization. And that was across all scenarios. So if you assign different assumptions about the cost of electricity, the costs of alternative pathways, we still saw a real foundational shift of the amount of clean energy that would be required to meet those goals. It's a little hard to break out from the slides there, but that middle wedge really is looking at offshore fixed and floating. And we do see that offshore wind really will play a significant resource role in the decades to come. We also see significant growth in solar as being a viable path for megawatt hours for clean electricity. And we do still see a need for a balancing for reliability purposes, a natural gas / hydrogen facility to balance the intermittent renewables. So this was done to look at the least cost pathway. It is not a plan for the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources or Energy and Environmental Affairs. Rather, it has informed what we established for a plan that goes through 2030. But it is informative of what will be guiding, I think, this region and Massachusetts as the resources to consider. And I wanted to create that kind of framework because it does assess the scale that we're really looking at, and that may be a doubling of the megawatt hours from clean energy and over the next couple decades. Next slide. So if you look at what is the portfolio of policies, I'd go back to what this region really saw in 2013, 2014, and with the retirements of the two nuclear facilities, it was instructive for the legislature and the governor to look at resources that really meet the demands of our winter cold periods. And ultimately in 2016, the legislature authorized procurements for offshore wind up to 1,600 megawatts, and also for clean energy, which did include hydro imports. And I think that was largely driven to diversify the clean energy resources that we have in the region to meet the demands of what was vulnerability for the region during cold snaps. And ultimately what that has led is we have built upon the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, which is really the foundation of our energy standard, that we have built additional policies to support both existing resources, which that clean energy standard existing, we have a portfolio where existing nuclear assets would be eligible for, as well as a clean energy standard for new resources into the region, including hydro. We have also adopted a policy to promote the deployment of clean energy during peak periods. That was established 1 year ago, and that is trying to get ahead of what we've seen of that primarily solar has really altered what our peak periods are. And I'll go into this a little bit further, but the Clean Peak Standard is trying to ensure that we deploy clean energy when we need it most, which yields specific ratepayer benefits, and we're learning has important distribution system benefits as well. So this is the kind of the range of our different portfolio standards that exist in Massachusetts today. Next slide. I think it's important to think about what your goals are with a program. We certainly saw from our long-term decarbonization roadmap that the least cost pathway could include a lot of first existing resources, hydropower resources, and offshore wind from a cost effectiveness standpoint. I think from for a lot of reasons, solar will continue to be an important policy tool, both from economic development in the Commonwealth, and also for trying to align meeting megawatt hours where demand is focused. And that was revealed in the roadmap. We have set up, as I think for the last decade, we've sort of recognized that there should be a specific solar program that continues to lower costs and tries to align with some of the intersection of land use. So I won't go through all of the details in this, but the SMART program is a tariff-based program which moved away from an environmental attribute program, which was the SREC. And that really did create a lot of stability for compensation. It is something that I would recommend a lot of states to consider as a model. And there are policy levers embedded in it that create either incentives of where the solar is located or subtraction in the amount of compensation based on whether it is building in new greenfield areas. One big change we've made recently is to require all projects over 500 kilowatts to be paired with storage. And we've increasingly tried to increase compensation and make it easier for lower income customers to access the program. We have looked to expand this to 3,200 megawatts, and that is in a proceeding at the department. A lot to get into with this program, but I think I'll conclude there. Next slide. The Clean Peak Standard is an interesting policy that really tries, as I think all of the audience is aware, the real structure of all of our environmental attribute programs is an annual compliance period that is not based on when you're really producing the electricity. Yet in New England, especially, we do see very scarce periods that constrains our natural gas system, relies on oil, and ultimately we do have challenges with our distribution system if we oversaturate solar. So pairing with storage is a key opportunity, and the Clean Peak Standard, which was established last year, we do have now 37 megawatts of participating resources, and is really trying to drive at balancing the production of clean energy resources during the seasons. We provide higher incentives for producing clean energy during summer peak areas and winter, and also doing producing during historic peak periods. I think it is an important aspect to consider really integrating storage throughout all of your policies. And I think it's just, we're scratching the surface at how that technology can be used as a distribution resource, a transmission asset, and ultimately improve the outcomes of using renewables as a decarbonization pathway. So we are looking to create an RFP that creates a financeable product for this. We just issued a straw proposal for that a couple weeks ago. But interesting results from this policy that tries to address, I think, what we're seeing of renewables start having a declining marginal value the more you start producing it. And I don't think it's a good policy outcome that we ultimately have high renewable generation during certain hours and then rely on fossil generation during colder hours during peak periods. So it is an effort to kind of get ahead of the curve of an emerging constraint on our electrical system and for the resources here in New England. Next slide. This is where we see our load based on all of those attribute markets and what our retail load is anticipated for going to 2050. So you can see that we, at this point, are projected to get close to what our retail load would be in 2050 with all of the requirements. We continue to think through the interaction of the Clean Energy Standard long term, and we certainly think that there does need to be some regional coordination of establishing a clean energy standard regionally. We're undertaking a review of the CES currently. But we do see the interaction of the CES and all of these policies with electrification is also important, as we could see a significant increase on the annual compliance rate, as this is a percentage of a total load. We could see a significant increase in the 2030s of what the actual megawatt hours are required on from our portfolios. Next slide. This goes to an issue that I think I saw a question about this that we're trying to get ahead of. It's important to know the benefits of an attribute market and its limitations. We certainly see the whole NEPOOL GIS system and the renewable portfolio standards as being critical for tracking of progress. Yet it is limited in its effectiveness in actually generating additionality. And when I say that, talking to developers, it really is not a stable incentive that creates the predictability that a contract delivers. So as a result, we have relied on contracts to really obtain new projects, and ultimately how Massachusetts pursues it is through a procurement. Yeah, thank you. If you go to the next slide. Through all of these procurements that Massachusetts has gotten very good at, but what these are obtaining is both a product, which is the environmental attributes, as well as a fixed price per kilowatt. So we have done that, and this will actually create some additional challenges with our RPS market as these projects have gotten larger in scale. They have significant impacts on the supply of RECs on the overall market. And as a result, it may introduce additional volatility to the regional REC markets. So that is highlighting what the RPS compliance is and what we see with our offshore wind procurements. The two that have contracts are the Vineyard Wind Project and the Mayflower Project. That is all to be said, that I think there is a moment, if you go to the next slide, that the current procurement model does have some significant limitations, one of which it's very hard to coordinate with a partner like Vermont or any other state, as it's very focused on utilizing our electric distribution companies. And I won't go through all of these, but we increasingly think that the current structure does not deliver the type of scale and predictability that our roadmap has highlighted may be necessary to meet our decarbonization goals. And I think lastly, I get into here the one structure that we've looked at regionally. If you go to the next slide, is an FCEM proposal, which we see a lot of merit to, which would allow a predictable regional product integrated into our markets at the ISO New England level, that would allow states to elect different levels of ambition, but not require any state to participate. One thing that we also see is a real compelling aspect of its design is municipalities and companies could participate. One thing that we are increasingly asked is how companies or municipal light plants in Massachusetts can participate in our offshore wind bids, but it's very limited in an electric distribution company procurement model. So we do see that this could open the door to democratizing a lot of scalable clean energy procurements, and kind of builds on what we're seeing as the limitations of what the existing attribute market is in New England while delivering the type of megawatt hours that our roadmap sees as necessary in the coming decade. Obviously, a lot of work that needs to be done regionally, and ISO New England is studying this design and is committed to delivering those results in the first quarter of next year. I think I conclude with one last slide here about we do see by creating this type of market, we do see some important voids that would be left of ensuring economic development, which is important to all states individually, and also ensuring that equity issues and environmental justice issues, permitting issues would still be considered within that framework. And I think that would be up to each individual state working together to try to create alignment to ensure that those aspects are still considered going forward. So with that, I'll conclude. I hope I didn't go too far over in the presentation, and open for some further discussion or questions.
Thanks, Patrick. So questions for Patrick about the Massachusetts model before we go to a broader conversation about renewable energy standards here in Vermont. Patrick, or no, sorry, Philip, can you let me know if the people have their hands raised?
Sure, I don't see any raised hands right now, except now I do from Carrick Johnson. Please go ahead.
Go, Carrick.
First of all, do I call you Commissioner Woodcock? What the heck how do I refer to you?
I think in this setting, Commissioner Patrick, Mr. Woodcock works.
Patrick, first of all, thank you very much. And I know you zipped through a bit, but it was data rich, insightful. So thank you very much. I'm really grateful that you took the time to be with us. So thank you for that. I'm zeroing in on your comments about regional coordination, and especially with regards to a clean energy standard. If there's one thing you'd ask us to consider, please, as we embark upon this work, mindful of the huge impact Massachusetts and Massachusetts policy has on the development of New England policy, what would you encourage us to think about? Do you see areas where Vermont and Massachusetts could more closely align our policies? I'm thinking in particular, I work for Vermont Electric Power Company, a transmission company, especially in the areas of transmission. Why don't I stop there? I'm looking for areas. I take your point about the obstacles. Where would you point us in terms of finding solutions for greater collaboration, please?
Yeah, I would say, I think this is a two-way street that Massachusetts wants to harmonize with all other states, but really trying to create, we are a regional market, and trying to create as much consistency across the region has benefits for all the companies, all the developers that are really regional companies. And I really would recommend, and this goes to all states, of trying to create as much consistency as possible. These have happened organically over the years, and we've created layers upon layers of policies. We certainly would welcome trying to create as much consistency regionally, and ultimately that we create a market that delivers cost-effective, clean energy for all of us. So create as much consistency as possible.
Thank you.
Dave Farnsworth, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hey, Commissioner, thanks so much for that presentation. It was a whirlwind, but there are lots of great things going on in Massachusetts. Can you explain to me a little bit the difference between your concept of a forward clean energy market and just the forward purchases of RECs? For instance, Washington Electric Co-op here in Vermont developed a landfill, and they sold the next 3 years or 5 years, whatever specifics was, of their RECs in order to help finance that. What would be the difference between doing something simple as that and the FCEM that you've described?
I think it's scale, Dave. I think how you just described it is what we're trying to build upon. I think it's hard for a lot of developers to use the attribute market as a counterparty to receive financing. It sounds like this facility was. More typically, it's a bilateral contract for price per kilowatt hour and potentially the attributes as well. So what we'd be attempting to see is, have we reached a point where developers can finance a product on a rec market alone that has a scale that delivers the types of projects we've seen proposed in the last 10 years, reduces risk for ratepayers in that they are absorbing the market price of the wholesale market price for energy and also capacity. So I don't think it's that dissimilar from what you just described, but on just a much greater level.
Thank you.
And Liz Miller is next with her hand raised.
Sure, thanks. And thank you, Patrick, for taking the time to present this. Really helpful. I'm wondering, picking up on your comment to Carrick about regional consistency among the states, if you could comment on Massachusetts, both rationale, I guess, and also maybe the drama behind the scenes, you know, what went into the decision to create, as a part of the clean energy standard, an existing tier, which in my understanding now does count Hydro-Quebec and some other resources as, you know, toward the carbon goals of the state. We've had a lot of discussion in Vermont about HQ, and if you were on this earlier or look through the chat, you'll see it's a part of the discussion here today. And so I'm just wondering how Massachusetts made that decision and what factors went into it as you were considering it with stakeholders. Thanks.
Yeah, not an easy question. I mean, I think increasingly we do see that existing clean energy resources are going to be critical with the emission goals for 2030 that we have, 50% over 1990 levels. You know, we have had a lot of regional NESCO analysis that reveals how much harder it becomes if you lose the 2 existing nuclear power plants in New England to meet our decarbonization goals. I mean, we're also starting to see that we could see a scenario where very rapid electrification occurs, and how that might be met with could be without support for these existing resources. You could see more pressure on building new fossil generation. So that obviously is not something we're looking to, an outcome we're looking to have realized. I'd say lastly, it's looking at our winter profile and what resources really can deliver to meet cold snap periods. And we, you know, we are seeing modeling that is alarming about just our vulnerability during winter cold snaps if offshore wind is not coincident to those periods, and what that would leave us for really the other resources that are available to us become natural gas, which becomes constrained, and then oil. So it's really trying to assess what all of these resources can do to meet our peak energy challenges. The time that it gets me most concerned is those winter cold snaps. So I don't know if that directly answered your question, Liz, but try to give some context of some of the decision making.
And James, I do see your hand, but let me go to a question from the chat, which is, how is Massachusetts approaching issues for people who live next to proposed large-scale solar and wind? And is Mass going to continue to allow cutting forests for solar?
So I did touch on this a bit. We did make some policy changes that prohibit solar development in GIS data layers that are critical ecosystems, and we have retained reduced compensation levels for greenfield areas. You can imagine that created a lot of healthy public policy debate in Massachusetts. Hear from all sides on that issue. So there are now new restrictions on where the SMART incentive can be received. We are trying to balance the disbursement of solar. We have seen a high amount of megawatts come on for greenfield development, and we certainly are trying to target more development on buildings, brownfield sites, and closer to load, as that has benefits on our distribution system. So yes, I guess the answer is yes. We are trying to increasingly pair land use considerations into our solar programs.
Thank you. James Givens, you're up, please.
Commissioner, thank you. Just a comment, you had mentioned something about the you were showing a graph of the New England Class 1 rec markets and implying that, I think you implied that those were merchant positions. And I think an earlier question sort of also said that there are a lot of cases where those transactions are themselves underlied by contracts. So just noting the difference in that. I mean, again, BED uses those rec markets to manage its purchases versus its needs at the moment, but we're the one actually contracting for the long-term risk of the rec prices, not the markets. So is that similar to your earlier answer, which is a question of scale?
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make is that if you look at that market as a developer, that has inherent risk to use the attribute markets as a means of financing. So in Massachusetts, the policy that we've enabled is then going for long-term contracts that have a energy attribute all in 20-year price contract. And I guess the point I was trying to make is people, I think a lot of policymakers think of it as an incentive to generate more clean energy, yet it isn't resulting in itself as a primary vehicle for new clean energy generation, at least in Massachusetts.
I would add the at least in Massachusetts, because again, BED certainly, has gone above 100% renewable and is using that market as sort of a backstop to the contracting that we're making. So.
And you're able to use that to get new projects built?
Yeah, well, yeah, our developers can. So we're the contracting entity. They'll go with the purchase power agreement for financing. We're willing to potentially take on lumpiness in terms of having our purchases at any given time maybe be greater than our RES need, because we can use the rec markets to temporarily arbitrage this part we don't need.
Yeah, so. But is that also with a energy contract associated? Yeah, yes. That's the issue.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're signing bundled contracts. That is true.
Yep, exactly. That's what is necessary in Massachusetts as well, a bundled product.
And the next hand raised is from Ken Nolan.
Thank you. I just want to put a fine point on that conversation that Patrick and James just had. I think that's one key difference between Massachusetts and Vermont. Vermont never deregulated. Our utilities are vertically integrated and have been right along. So we are, in order to meet our state renewable goals, the Vermont utilities are signing 20 or 25-year bundled contracts and have been right along. I think other states where they deregulated and the utilities get out of the generation business, you're actually seeing re-regulation in these state procurements as a way to make the renewables happen. So, we're in a position that's a little bit different in that the Vermont utilities have been the backstop. As a power supply person, I had developers come to me right after Massachusetts deregulated and only want to do business with Vermont because that's how they got their financing backed. We could do contracts and no one else could. So I think you've hit on a very key topic in getting new renewables done and the structure that has to be in place. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Ed McNamara.
Thanks. So Patrick, thanks for that. That was really helpful for us as we're thinking about how to design our renewable policies, understanding what you're doing in Massachusetts. Again, you're doing some interesting stuff there. Invite you to stay on. I think we're going to continue the conversation we started before you joined about different design considerations. I am going to ask folks specifically about some of the comments that you made, and understand if you need to drop off, but invite you to stay on. Obviously, entirely up to your schedule.
Yeah.
So.
No, thank you again for the invitation and lively discussion. And please let us know how we can collaborate going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. So one of the questions I want to follow up on is in response to a question by Carrick. Patrick noted that consistency in programs, keeping in mind, as George had noted earlier, we're part of a regional grid. I'm curious as to folks' response to that particular proposition. It is interesting because each state has their own ability to set their own policies, ability to set their own goals. At what point do you focus on what's unique to Vermont, and what point do you focus on how we fit into the broader regional grid? So I'll just throw that question out. James popped right up.
Hey, Ed. I think I really appreciated the comment from the commissioner, because I think for me, what's really important here in Vermont is that the basic structures align. It's not that every state has to select the exact same percentages of X and Y and Z, but fundamentally we're all playing in the same by the same rules. And I think that's a foundational principle for our energy policy moving forward. And I think Vermont has been very creative in the past and identified ways to play by a slightly different set of rules. And, one of those early rules in speed focused on the need for those long-term contracts. So it helped get stuff built. But the reality is, moving forward, we need to be done playing around the margins and actually have a foundation that all states are playing with the same basic rules on energy policy, so that we can move a little faster and more consistently.
Oh, great, thanks, James. Anybody else want to respond to that? Because that is something that's actually really interesting to me. I do think there's a lot of merit in that. Patrick at the end mentioned the forward clean energy market that we've been looking at. Our current renewable energy standard doesn't particularly fit well with coordinated procurement across the region, particularly given that new resources, the renewable energy standard as it currently stands, really only incentivizes new resources located within Vermont, which would be too narrow a category for a regional procurement. Ken.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to go back to something I said this morning, which is I think having a regional framework where we're aligned in what's being asked for would be very helpful. I get very nervous when I hear about centralized procurement and multi-state purchasing that's then going to be forced down on the utilities and their consumers to purchase, because every utility in Vermont is in a different place. I think many of us are ahead of what's happening in other states as far as how much renewables we have under contract, and a regional approach to actually making a procurement could further disadvantage us from a cost perspective. So I think we need to be careful in moving toward a centralized framework, but keeping the ability to make decisions on how to meet that at the local level.
Thanks, Ken. That's a useful distinction. Carrick?
Thank you for posing the question. I guess my response, keying off of what Ken just said, I think I have these numbers right. I think we've invested about, there's costs right now that we as Vermonters are paying for, as well as the region. So the region has invested about 11 billion in transmission since 2002. And I think right now we're looking at an additional 1.6 billion is coming in transmission, of which Vermont pays about, say, roughly 4%. I know for some of you, we're having direct conversations that rising regional transmission costs are one of the drivers for some rate cases. So we're very mindful of that. And so currently there is the current rules encourage, you can say it's competition, or you can say it's cannibalization in terms of how we pay for that system, in that we're competing to drive down peak load, and we're competing with Massachusetts and other New England states because it's a zero-sum game. So if Vermont reduces its proportion, its contribution at peak, well, someone else has to pay more. So we're in that competition right now. So I wonder if there is you put that against the backdrop of, do we want to utilize Hydro-Quebec or do we not? And given Vermont's geography between supply and demand, I wonder about a more regional policy, especially given the construct of transmission company ownership in Vermont, where the value goes back to the distribution utility and their customers. If there is a way to leverage, writ large, leverage our geography for the coupled with offshore wind to be able to utilize Hydro-Quebec more. Some folks might not like that, but if we are on fire, we're looking to be mindful of costs. Leveraging transmission as a tool for overall renewable energy and climate considerations is at least something, candidly, we are thinking about actively.
So Ed, can you speak to that regional coordination piece?
So, yeah, transmission gets really interesting. How do we, and there's definitely been a discussion about the increased transmission costs on a going forward as we integrate significant amounts of new offshore wind and also distributed generation. How are those costs allocated? That's a question both within Vermont and among the states in New England as well. And all I can say is it's a very complicated question. It's something that we need to address. And I would love to hear, I don't have a solution. I don't have a proposed solution at this point. I'm basically acting as a sponge at the moment and hearing as many good comments as we can about suggested policies on this one. Sorry, Carrick, I'm not trying to duck the question. It's a good point, but there's a lot in there that we just don't. There's a lot of policy in there that we just don't have proposed yet.
Other people have their hands raised, Philip?
Yes, Liz Miller, please go ahead.
Yeah, just picking up on Ed, you saying you wanted to be like a sponge. For climate council purposes, I do too. And so you mentioned something a second ago. I'm hoping others will be willing to give some reaction to it. Thinking about the regional consistency issue again, you said that, for example, the RES now only encourages new renewable here in Vermont through its design specifically. And, I know that a few years ago, when a policy discussion at the legislature occurred about 100% res coupled with, I think it was at the time, a doubling of tier 2 as well. I don't recall, I don't think there was a discussion as a part of that, whether a portion of that 100%, or of the 20 for that matter, but a portion of the total should be new renewables regionally. And I guess I'm wondering about if one thinks about 100% goal, so increasing the goal and therefore also increasing new renewables, how the balance should be struck, local in-state versus regional new, and do folks want to see a res redesign, if one is taken up, include specific goals for new renewables regionally that looks more like what our other states do, or not? I'm interested in what people think about that.
So do people have comments? I think we're
So I
stuck.
did
with it.
see,
Go ahead.
I was just saying, so I know Annette had her hand up, but in response to Liz's specific question, it looked like Sam and George and Steve all raised their hands. Annette, we'll get back to you. I do
Yes,
want to
pass
hear
over to me,
that.
please.
Okay.
Thank you.
And just checking in, we have about 10 minutes before we wrap up. So if you all, there are at least 4 people who want to make comments, or so if you could be concise, that would be great. So over to you, Annette.
Excuse me, Cindy, real quick. This is Billy Coster on the phone. I'd just like a chance to speak briefly before we break also. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Billy. Yeah, I haven't checked in with the phone folks. So go ahead, Billy.
Great, thanks. Billy Coster, Agency Natural Resources. Apologies, I'm traveling today, so on the phone. And thanks everyone for a great conversation. Just 2 very quick points as we're looking to potentially increase the renewable energy standard requirements in Vermont, that any incentives really maximize the carbon reduction benefits of new plants in a net way, looking at embodied emissions associated with siting and construction, that as we're getting a cleaner and cleaner mix, that we really want to drive the carbon reduction benefits of every new facility that comes online to the extent that that's practical and feasible. Second point is that as new distributed plants in state become more prevalent in Vermont, they're already a significant part of our landscape. We're envisioning a future where they're even a bigger component of our land use. That's a positive thing if it's done well. So we really need to pair any increased incentives and requirements with better planning, maintaining levels of natural resource protection, if not increasing them, so that we can have both a cleaner energy supply in the future and a continued landscape that's adaptive and resilient as the climate changes. So just 2 very high level points for folks to consider as we move the conversation forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Billy. And we just have a few minutes left. I think all of the people with their hands raised have spoken before. I'd ask you to be concise because you can expand on your comments via the written word. Annette, you're first, and then there are 4 or 5 other people. So go ahead, Annette.
Well, I raised my hand before Liz asked her question, so there are people who want to respond to that question, so I'll just be brief. I took a look at the agenda, and under the first question, facilitated discussion regarding 100% renewable energy standard design considerations, is 1 bullet point citing including environmental, community, and transmission system considerations. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, and the only broken record on this, I think it's critically important that these discussions include community. We have seen projects that put the word community in it. I saw one recently, and I know nobody in the community knows about it. I have great positive experience with stakeholder processes. Consensus Building Institute put one on in 2011 for industrial wind developers. None of them have done it, but it was a very good education, and I have done it before with major corporations. We need to come up with a new paradigm, a new way of siting. And it's not just about whether it's a prime ag soil field. It is about the people, because we are creating victims. We're not compensating people. We're not taking into consideration what happens to people if they can't live in their homes. We have to have that as part of the discussion, and we have to do this in a more constructive and collaborative way, and not this cram it down their throats, which is really the model that we are still on track for if we don't make a change. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. And I think the department heard that. Could somebody confirm that you understand the importance of getting community input?
Yep, absolutely. And that's something I mentioned before, Act 174, including communities in the planning process, which we can always do better on all of that. And we can do better on the siting aspects as well. So thank you for that.
Okay, so over to George, and with an understanding that we only have a few minutes left, George. So longer comments would be better by email, but go ahead.
Certainly. Okay. So I had a couple observations about some of the conversations that when you compare we've been talking about Hydro-Quebec and offshore wind as potentially large-scale utility resources for power that's reasonably low carbon. Hydro-Quebec may not be the panacea that we would hope it to be. And as I expressed in the chat message I sent in earlier, it turns out they are actually an energy importer in the Quebec ISO region for the months of November through March, the wintertime. They've got their resources at max, and they're net importers at this point. They do have a new reservoir coming online in the 2025 timeframe, but I should also point out the new reservoirs come with much larger carbon footprints and methane and carbon dioxide because of the initial biogenic decay that goes on with the new reservoir. And the next dam beyond that they are considering doing is not coming online until 2030. So even though these out-of-state resources provide access to economies of scale, and may have lower cost of electricity, levelized cost of electricity, it's not clear that they're necessarily going to work out that way. Offshore wind in particular, the Lazarus study I'm familiar with from 2017.
I'm sorry, George, to rush you, but we don't have much time.
This is my last sentence. I'll button it up. The offshore wind, levelized cost of electricity for offshore wind is about 3 times higher than it is for onshore wind. And so I'm concerned that by going to offshore wind, there's going to be a difficult problem of how to swallow that larger cost per unit of electricity. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have, I think, 2 more people. Is that right, Philip? James and Carrick, with their hands raised. Nope, Carrick down. So is it just one?
And I'm not sure, did Sam, did you get to respond to Liz's comments?
So, sorry.
No, I didn't. And my comment is very short and to the point. I strongly support the notion that that these goals and be framed in a way that is consistent within the region. Part of the difficulty in understanding the whole process in a common sense way is the complexity and the outline, the complexity of the differences and the fact that Vermont is an outlier. Second, I think not only goals, but I also think measurement, how we measure climate emissions from different sources ought to be aligned with how it's being done in the region, so that we're using a measurement framework that's consistent. Now, there's a lot more to say, but I'll leave it there since we're short of time.
Thanks, Sam. So I believe we have one more person with their hand raised. Philip, that's James. Are we right? Is that
yes?
Right? Okay. So James, you have a few minutes.
I understand it. Yes, thank you. But you're continually saying that is actually taking more time than people's comments at this point. So just a quick note is that we're talking about changing the RES inside its 5th year. I think that is really, to answer Liz's question, one of the things that is incumbent is to remember that other utilities have made decisions both prior to the current RES and under the current RES that I think need to be honored if they were made in good faith. So I think you can't constantly change definitions on people and have past decisions be invalidated.
Okay. So do you hear that, department?
Yep, completely understand. And that's, it's not like the department would propose something that would change overnight. We're looking, the CEP is looking at 2050. The GWSA also looks at 2050 as well, GHG reductions, and it's a marathon in addition to a lot of sprints too. So.
Great, thanks, Ed. And Claire, could you move to the next slide?
Great, and so thanks, Cindy, for helping facilitate this. And thank you to everyone who joined. I do want to recognize this was 4 hours. I really appreciate everybody staying in here, staying in the conversation. Also recognizing that 4 hours really isn't that much time given the complexity and all the issues that we're talking about. So what we have right here on the screen is additional opportunities to comment. Unfortunately, at the moment, we still have two different mechanisms for commenting on the Climate Action Plan, the Comprehensive Energy Plan. All these comments are going to be public. This video is going to be posted on our website as well, so this will be available. Also, just a real quick fill up, if you could actually capture the chat to make sure that we save this, so that we can make sure that we have all the comments that were in the chat as well. So I do want to just thank everybody again. Thanks Cindy, Philip, and Claire for all the work. Liz and Chad for helping organize this. And Jane as well for all the work that you're doing on the Climate Council. And at that, I want to thank everybody for participating, and we'll see you all at some point. And encourage you to send comments. Really appreciate it. More input we get, the better the process is. Thanks very much.